Hello and welcome wherever you are around the world on this May 10, 2023, the Wednesday after the Miami Grand Prix, 10 days before the Imola Grand Prix. Welcome to all Formula One fans to our live stream chat. A big thanks to Jetcraft, one of the great supporters of this channel, the world's biggest buyer and seller of executive jets around the world. Amazing company, and good to see that Jetcraft sponsored Jack Doohan was quickest in F2 testing today in Barcelona. Hope he keeps it up. Hasn't been a great start of the year for young Jack, son of Mick, of course. Anyway, looking forward to looking back at Miami. The race was so amazing, I thought, between the two Red Bull drivers, particularly obviously the drive by Max, that I didn't really get a chance. I got no chance to talk about anybody else in the video I did on the Sunday night. So hopefully we can look at some of those things as well, and some of those other results, starting with Fernando Alonso, of course, who finished P3. And looking forward to having all your input. So lots of chat already coming through on the chat box in YouTube. Thank you very much for that. So with no more ado, let's begin. M.A. Khan. Lewis is the closest driver to Max on race pace. Over one lap, he's slower than George, Charles and Max. Where can he improve to close the gap? Without the fastest car, it costs several starting positions. Well, yeah, I think he's right there, to be honest. And he didn't make the mistake that Max made in qualifying, did he? He kept it together, kind of. There were other issues. I think we should give Lewis a little bit of slack. I mean, 7 times world champion, been racing in Formula One since 2007, which is a long time ago. And, he's right there in the mix of it, really. Yeah, maybe he gives a 10th now to George, maybe, on one lap. If it's some really on it for the entire lap, maybe George has got him. But I think race pace wise, he's right there. And he makes up, if, and it's a big if, he is maybe a 10th away from George on some circuits. He makes up for it in a number of other ways, as I've said before. This incredible feel for managing the car and for dealing with the variables that come into play in the course of a race. But yeah, this guy, he cannot go on forever, that is for sure. And I've been saying since the start of 2022 that, with George in that other Mercedes, regardless of how good or bad the car is, it's going to be a problem for Lewis because George is super, super quick. He's on the pace all the time. And I repeat again what I've been saying since then, which is I think Lewis actually has been doing an amazing job considering the road dust he's got now, how long he's been around, been there, done that. And he's now driving a car that is not capable of winning a Grand Prix, let alone a championship. And he's more or less there, still mixing it with them. So that's my response, really. Yeah, I mean, I don't think he can or would need to change anything so far as driving is concerned. I think, obviously, if he's in a great car, it's going to make, I think the gap will be a little bit, I was going to say closer between Lewis and George, but I think it might bring out a couple of other points that Lewis can do with a great car, to do with his great racing brain and the way he thinks. So it's a different thing, it's a different thing if he's in a bad car or a good car. And if he's not in a great car, I don't think anybody should be out there saying, Lewis, why are you a 10th slower than George Russell at this stage of his career? I think I don't think we should be doing that. Maddie Ark. Hey, Peter. Long-time follower. Thank you very much indeed, Maddie. Appreciate all your motorsport Formula One insights. What is your take on Karun's idea of mandating all 3 tyre compounds in a race? Well, I'm not absolutely, in Pirelli's inner sanctum of knowing exactly how much it costs to produce tyres, and they do it obviously well in advance. They have to know exactly what they're going to be producing. And Formula One has settled on this formula of using 2 compounds, in other words, ensuring 1 pit stop. What Karun's basically saying is 2 pit stops per race. And I think that's fine, and it's a good idea in many ways. And it's not as if it's an idea. I mean, it's always been out there on the table. But the reason they've never done that, as my understanding, is that to do that would put up, again, the production costs for Pirelli, because they'd have to produce a lot more tyres, of that third compound. So it's always been out there as a potential thing, and it's never been accepted because in this era in which we work and live, i.e. the budget cap, let's keep costs down as low as possible, minimize the amount of testing, no spare car, all the rest of it. I think it's always been my understanding that part of helping Pirelli is to keep it down to 2 race compounds, purely from a cost point of view. And that comes under the heading of Pirelli not having to spend massive amounts on technology development, research and development, and production, and just trying to keep all those costs as low as possible. Formula One benefits a lot from Pirelli's PR budgets and advertising budgets. If Pirelli say, yeah, we can now do it without spending any more money, or the teams are going to subsidize it, great idea, I'd go for it. But I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened by now, to be honest. So that's my response to that one, I think. Luke Noonan. Lewis being asked to let George buy was unusual. Do you think it was the right call, Peter? George didn't let Lewis buy in Jeddah when he was on the newer, softer compound medium tyre. I didn't. I just saw it, as a completely normal thing when they're on different strategies. Of course, these issues of team orders and letting somebody past or not letting them past they're only relevant really when they're on the same strategy. And if they're on different strategies, you'd have to be. It depends. Obviously, depends on the situation. But in the situation they were in Miami, it was an obvious, clear call to make, and I don't think Lewis had any issues with that. I'd be surprised if he did, because it was a different strategy completely. So why would he just stay? I think Lewis just needs to know what's going on, and then logically he'll do the right thing. I think that's how I see that, and I don't think there was an issue over it. That's my understanding. But thanks for the question. I mean, it's not to say, of course, that if Mercedes were at the front of the race and were fighting for the World Championship, and it was pretty clear that it was going to be one or the other, like Verstappen or Perez this year, it's not to say that it wouldn't be more of an issue at that point. But where they are now, I don't think it was an issue at all. But I think on this thing about team orders and everything else, I've got to make another point now about Fernando. It's getting a little bit over the top, I think, Fernando. All these comments about Lance all the time, ingratiating the Alonso side of the garage to the whole Stroll thing, and who's Lance racing with? That was a great pass into who is Lance racing with? That was a great pass into turn 1. I mean, that's a bit over the top, I think. Anyway, but that's bear in mind Lance was the guy that took him out in Austin last year. So I think that was more of a iffy comment to me than the other one, than the Merc one. M.A. Carnigan, when a former Mercedes engineer was comparing Lewis, Kimi and Mika, he said Lewis was the most complete of the 3. Kimi had the most natural talent and Mika quickest over a lap. Well, if Kimi has the most natural talent, why wasn't he quickest over a lap? I think that's a bit of a cop-out description, isn't it? Because, what does that mean? Most natural talent, but then he wasn't quicker than Mika over a lap. So what he needs to be saying is why, in his view, if Kimi had the most talent, he wasn't quicker than Mika over a lap. I would be I'd be struggling to say and to convince myself that Kimi had more natural talent than either Lewis or Mika, to be honest. I don't see how anybody, of those 3, I think Lewis has got the most natural talent, because he's the most complete racing driver, and that's what it's all about. It's doing the job and being able to do all the other stuff as well, and that's pure natural talent. But I think so. I would put Lewis ahead of both of them. So far as Kimi and Mika go, I think I would give the nod to Mika. Actually, I think Kimi was very, very quick for a very short period of time, and then, for reasons that we won't go into, went slightly off the boil, and you have to take that into account. That has to be part of the assessment of it. So, I don't actually agree with that, to be honest. But thanks for the question. Yeah, good one. I think Lewis is more naturally talented the most naturally talented of those three, for sure. Angry Gamer Show. What a name. Hi, Peter. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Merc versus Aston Martin battle. Not a good look for the factory team getting blown away consistently by their customer team. You can say that again. And I think Ferrari with Haas Ferrari would feel the same way, wouldn't they? It was not a good look at all. And, I saw Toto's comments after the race were along the lines of, the problem with our car is it has an incredibly small operating window, and when we're in the operating window, we're pretty good. We're not there with Red Bull, we're pretty good. But when we're out of the operating window, which we do quite regularly because it has a small window, we're not that good. But of course, that is the case. That has always been the case with any car that lacks the grip it needs in order to be at the front of a Grand Prix. Whether we're going back 20, 30 years, that's always been the case. You take off downforce, you do all the things you can in order to make the car competitive. And when you do that, you make the window smaller and smaller and smaller. That's the whole point about having aero efficiency these days, or back in the days of pre-aero, go back to the Lotus, supple suspension, lightweight, stiff chassis days. That was the same thing. They had a much wider window with which to play, always wider than Cooper or BRM, generally speaking, in terms of grip and handling. So there's nothing new there. And for Toto to say after Miami, as if it's some sort of light bulb that's gone off, oh, we have a really small operating window. Well, you have a small operating window because the car's not very good. And the car's not very good because it's not as efficient aerodynamically as an Aston Martin, which isn't as efficient aerodynamically as a Red Bull. So it's 2 steps away from where it should be, the Mercedes, that is. So I think a lot of the talk at the back end of last year was, are Mercedes going to scrap this basic concept and go down the route of Red Bull? And you could argue Aston Martin in that comment. And everybody was speculating as to what would happen. My view was, given the history of Mercedes, the way they tend to stick with themes and make that car work and develop it, that they wouldn't do that, and they would continue. Also because it would be a face-saving thing to do. That's a very easy word to say, face-saving. Of course, it's a much bigger thing than that, but a face-saving thing nonetheless will suffice at this point. And they did that. They stayed with it, as I kind of predicted. And personally, I think it was a mistake. I didn't say it was the right thing to do. I said that's what I thought they would do. But you're now listening to a guy that was around in 1984 when Lotus were in massive trouble with, it was after the passing of Colin Chapman, and they were in massive trouble with the car. Couldn't, it's too heavy, too this, too that, flexing. And they hired Gérard Ducarouge, who had done a very good job at Ligier and at Alfa Romeo. He basically only designed one type of car, but it was a super stiff, very light, very, very nicely put together chassis. And in those days, it was a carbon chassis as well, and carbon Kevlar in the case of Lotus. And he came over from France, and he literally worked. He rented a sort of really scabby bungalow next to the Lotus factory, and just started working 24/7. Constant flow of Gitan or Gauloise cigarettes coming out of the chimney all night, all day and all night. And he designed this car, and it was literally like 6 weeks, and they were out there racing. And the first Grand Prix was Silverstone, and straight away the car was incredibly quick. And of course today it's a completely different world. It's a budget cap world. It's a world with 1,000 people. It's all these middle management things. It's all these committees. It's everything else. All these different parts of the car that are designed by subcommittees and subsections. So you could never do that today, alas. But nonetheless, that's kind of what I think Formula One expects of its sport, does it not? As I said before, the technology is something that's really fascinating. And if it was given a little bit more freedom in which to express itself, the technology that is. And we knew that in order to try to have 5 Grand Prix wins under their belt, Mercedes were going to be doing this completely new car, which was going to be making its debut at Spa. Wouldn't that be a great thing? We'd all be speculating about it and talking about it, and everyone would be fired up. And it could well be. I got to have a rider here. It could well be that they are doing that, and they're just doing a really good job of, diverting attention from it. But the signs are that they're not, and they're continuing with this basic theme. And it's a great shame. It's a great shame to see Mercedes unable to beat their customer team. It's a great shame to see drivers like Lewis and George not fighting for race wins. It's a great shame for Formula One, and that's partly because they got it so wrong last year. Well, it's all because they got it completely wrong last year, and then they didn't make the change. They haven't decided to make that change. Assuming they haven't made the change. I mean, as I say, it's possible they are still going to suddenly appear with a Red Bull and be really quick. Because here's another thing. Mercedes might have argued, well, if we go the Red Bull route, we're kind of never going to be better than Red Bull, and they're always going to be one step ahead of us, and we'll be using up all our budget money and everything else. But, that actually doesn't take into account the quality of its drivers and the quality of the team itself. So if you had a car that was basically a Red Bull philosophy car, but not quite as quick as a Red Bull, but you got George and Lewis there, and you've got all the other stuff that Mercedes do pretty well, the chances are, by the law of averages, at least they'll be fighting for a win, and they might get a couple of wins. As I said back in the last year, maybe one of the worst things that happened to Mercedes was winning that Brazilian Grand Prix the way they did, because there was a lot of throwing of hats in the air and a lot of, see, we were justified. Next race, Abu Dhabi, they weren't very good, but that was kind of swept under the carpet. And then they went into the winter. And it was because Red Bull got the ride heights on their car so massively wrong in Brazil, because it was a sprint weekend, that Mercedes won that race. If it was a normal Grand Prix weekend, Red Bull would have blitzed Brazil. And I don't think at Mercedes that message really got through. And I think that was one of the reasons they sort of gone down this path again. So it's a shame. Peter H says, evening. I wonder if that's a Peter H that I know and work with quite regularly. If it is, hi there. If it's not, hi there as well. Tommy says, everyone keeps mentioning the Red Bull suspension, dive and squat is the main answer to the other teams, and how long will it take to develop and catch up? Yeah, I don't at all. I don't think Scarbs does either. And I say not at all. Obviously, it's part of the overall thing. But it's the overall aero package that Adrian's created. And he's maximizing that with anti-dive, anti-squat, all the things that you do within the regulations to try to get a stable platform. But the platform itself is an incredibly efficient aero platform. And that is what the other teams don't have. It's not that they can't control it the way Red Bull are. They don't have the right thing to control in the first place. That's the issue, for sure. I think the anti-dive, anti-squat thing is very visible, and that's why people grasp it. But the reality is it comes down to Adrian and his team, aero team, and the car they've built around the aero parameters that they need. And they've all, as a result, the packaging department, the suspension department, battery department, whatever it is, power unit, they've all done a perfect job to complement everything Adrian wanted to do on that car. And that's not easy to do as well. And I think that points to the structure of the team and how well Red Bull functions as a structure in terms of the design and development of the car. Alex Lomax, hi Peter. Thank you for your informative videos. As a huge Charles fan, good to hear, I fear that he may need to leave Ferrari in order to win a world championship. Do you agree with this? Well, I was getting quite bullish about the whole new Charles, Freddie Vasseur partnership, sort of Colin Chapman, Jim Clark, or, Patrick Head, Alan Jones. Not that Freddie is a designer, of course, but after what they've had, I was getting bullish about Charles having this bond with Freddie Vasseur, who's a real racer, and they should be on the same wavelength. And yet, it all went south. It was terrible. I mean, Charles had a terrible weekend in Australia, or terrible qualifying in Australia, and therefore a terrible weekend. It kind of came back in Baku, where it's okay. Very good weekend, as good as you can have in a Ferrari in Baku. And personally, I was expecting Charles to do a similar job in Miami. And I think the car was just about there to do that. But he looked messy before he had his two offs. And then he had his two offs at the same place. And one of them was on a Saturday in qualifying when it really mattered, which was very un-Charles-like. It's quite Charles-like to do that sort of thing on a Friday. But to do it on a Saturday under pressure. Max Verstappen note was, that was unforgivable, which meant he qualified badly, different strategy off the line, didn't work early on, got there in the end behind Carlos Sainz. Not a great weekend, not where that car would have been capable of finishing, I think, had Charles had a normal Charles Leclerc weekend. So I've got to revise my thinking now because, to be honest with you, I don't think Freddie Vasseur should have allowed that sort of weekend to occur for Charles Leclerc. Does he just let Charles get on with it in terms of how hard he's going to push the car, knowing that they're right on this very small operation window, the Toto Wolff-like window of operation, and risk having more offs? Or does he say to Charles, you've got the pace over the lap. If you're going to go quickly, if you're really going to push it, don't push it in places where it isn't going to really matter. Don't push it through those S's before turn 7, because there's no real benefit there. Was he saying that to Charles? I don't know. I would like to think he was, because if it's an engineer saying that to Charles, he can sort of say, well, yeah, they always say that. But if it's Freddie Vasseur saying that, that's a different thing. And it appears as if Freddie didn't say that, in which case I'm very surprised and a bit disappointed, to be honest, because that's exactly what you needed to be saying to Charles Leclerc before, especially after Friday when he went off there. And after that he was just playing catch up. So I have to say, for me, I was disappointed with the whole Freddie Vasseur Charles Leclerc tie up in Miami and how it operated, or didn't operate at all. And meanwhile, Carlos Sainz did a pretty good job again. Very good job, really. I just kept it on the island, did a consistent fuel runs, and he was really good at in the race as well. In various stages of the race, he was pretty good. I mean, obviously the tyres weren't brilliant in some parts. Usual Ferrari story, tyre management. But on this occasion, he was doing a better job than Charles Leclerc. And that's a worry. That is a worry, because if Freddie's not going to be able to do something about Charles and really get the best from Charles, race in, race out, then Ferrari are in big trouble. In answer to your question, therefore, obviously, if Charles tomorrow was driving a Red Bull, he'd be winning Grand Prix at some point this year. I mean, it wouldn't be easy against Max, but he would be there or thereabouts. And I think if he was in a Red Bull, he'd be right up there with, for the championship. But he's not, and that's not going to happen, I don't think. As I said in the last live stream, I don't think they're ever going to put Charles Leclerc in a Red Bull so long as Max is in the other car. Which leaves what? It leaves Mercedes, it leaves Aston Martin, it leaves staying where you are. And right now, he's probably better off staying with Freddie Vasseur, believing in Freddie's talent at Ferrari, than he is going to Aston Martin, where it'll be a bit of a mess, and Mercedes, where I guess he would only go there if he's replacing Lewis. And he's replacing Lewis, he's got George in the other car and knows the team well. Probably he would enjoy being in England, or he'd enjoy the whole Anglophile Formula One team methodology after Ferrari, but it wouldn't be easy. That's his only chance. If he goes to Mercedes, replaces Lewis, but then he's got to beat George Russell. Not easy at all. Much more difficult than beating Carlos Sainz. So right now, I don't think Charles should be thinking of leaving Ferrari or where he would go. He needs to be thinking, what was I doing in Miami? I had a bad weekend in Melbourne. That's my bad weekend of the year. What am I doing repeating that in Miami? That's terrible. And so he's got to dig a bit deep now, going into Imola. Going into the rest of the year. Alex Lomax says, hi, Peter. Thank you for your informative videos. There's a huge... I've just done that one, sorry. Sven de Graaf. Just wondering how you would rank the drivers if their material was equal. Would Max still be number one? Again, I'm going to cop out of that one a little bit. What do you mean by equal material? Do you mean that they're all in purpose-built cars that come out from one huge garage and they all go out at exactly the same time, and all the tires are identical and the fuel loads the engines are identical? You can never really do that. I know it's a cop-out answer, but I don't know. Let's, you don't need to be too, as Rob Wilson has proved over the years, you can impart a lot of knowledge and a lot of tricks, if that's the right word, into how to drive well just in a road car around a deserted airfield. Manual transmission, please. Doesn't matter if it's front or rear wheel drive. Better if it's rear wheel. And you can do a lot with a slushy road car. So let's put them all in slushy road cars and see what happens. Would Max Verstappen win that race? I think he might. I think he's got a very good... Well, I mean, of course, yeah. I'm not going to say he's got a very good feel for it. Of course, I think Max would, actually, yeah. I mean, let's think who might beat Max in that situation. Kevin Magnussen might be up there. George would be quick. Lewis would. Yeah, I've driven with road cars with Lewis, and he's not slow. That is for sure. But it'd be an interesting one, wouldn't it? It brings me back to the old days of the rally sprint on BBC years ago. Back in the early 80s, they used to have this thing called the rally sprint, when they had 4 rally drivers and 4 Formula One drivers competing in various disciplines over the day, and they eventually had a circuit race. And bear in mind, this is long before he's ever in a competitive car. Nigel Mansell used to either win or finish second in the circuit race, and he'd always be top 3 in the rally stage as well. So I'd love to see that. I'm sure all the fans would. Of course, it'll never happen because all the Formula One drivers have such strong ties to manufacturers and sponsors. You can't do any of that stuff anymore. But it would be good. It would be a lot of fun to do that. And I don't know what you'd put them in. Electric Kias or something. I don't know. Good. I mean, it's good. You can talk about it for hours. Do I think Max would still win that? I think yes, probably he would. He'd probably have, Adrian and Jonathan Wheatley and all the boys from Red Bull there behind the scenes, getting the pressures exactly right. F1 Racing logo here. Wow, F1 Plus. There you go. Sorry, looks like the old F1 Racing logo. It's very small, but F1 Plus it is. Hi, mate. Do you think Mercedes is the team who'll get closer to Red Bull with the upgrades made for Imola, or Aston Martin's still going to keep a second place on the grid? Greetings from the US. Hi there. Well, it's a good question, isn't it? It's a really good question. I would say, given that Aston Martin have a higher baseline on which to be putting the upgrades, and already they've done quite a lot to the car to make it a bit quicker in a straight line for the same, more or less the same downforce, I'd say Aston Martin have more chance of not closing the gap, but of sustaining their position. And it's a bigger ask for Mercedes to go from where they are to having an altogether better car than Aston Martin in terms of one lap and the race. So, and bear in mind, we talk about upgrades. All the teams are going to have upgrades in Imola, just as all the teams kind of had them ready for Baku, but they've had to spread them out because of the back-to-back and Baku not being a great circuit anyway for running new bits. So, I still think Aston will be... It's difficult to imagine on a circuit like Imola now with the chicanes they've got. I can't imagine Fernando and the Aston not being super quick around there, by which I mean at least, if not quicker than an Aston and a Ferrari. Probably not Red Bull quick, but I think they'll be pretty close. I think it'll be a fairly closely matched race, Imola, in that respect. By the way, I've yet to receive a chat from anybody saying, hey, Peter, you predicted after Australia that Sergio Perez would win in Baku. I haven't received one saying that, so I'm just going to remind everybody that's what I did. Somebody said, who's going to win Baku? And I said, he'll bounce back. It'll be Perez for sure. Anyway, so there we go. Mate, George Horvath. Dear Peter, what do you think it would take for Williams to be a title contender team again? Why did Nigel Mansell decide to retire somewhat early, and why did you leave Williams, if I may ask? Right. Well, what it would take for Williams to be a title contender again would be... let's think about this one. I mean, they were midfield in qualifying in Miami. They faded a bit in the race, but they were okay. They'd certainly need two mega drivers, I think. I'm not saying Alex, maybe keep Alex, but if you had, say, Lando Norris, Alex Albon, let's say, and I think you'd need to get somebody somebody I don't know. I'm going to say, some of those Red Bull guys, but I'm not convinced about that. I mean, I know the aero. I know Jason Somerville's got a lot of time for the aero department still at Williams, and I think there's half a chance that they will start to continue to progress. I would say drivers, in the same way that I've said that about Toro Rosso, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, and other teams. I think if you have Max and George Russell in any team, it's going to respond. The team is going to respond because the engineering into the car is going to be much more defined as to the direction in which they have to go, given this budget cap world in which we live. So I think having really quick drivers, really polished and quick drivers, is worth more now than it's ever been worth, because it can send you in directions that are correct in a budget limited world. So it would never happen. But if you had Max and George in a Williams, and on the basis that Williams have enough money to be able to reach the ceiling of the budget cap, and I'm assuming they do. Doralton seems to be a hugely rich company, so I'm assuming they spend whatever they can on that team. Maybe I'm wrong there, but I'm taking that as a given in answer to your question. If they have that full budget, and if they have two drivers of that quality, I think with Vols there, I think they do have the potential then to be a race-winning team. I don't know about title contending, but race-winning. And it's drivers. I've always believed that it's drivers in terms of what you need in order to make a team work. And in answer to your question, it kind of is a part of that answer, because I'd worked with Nigel, grown up with Nigel, if you like, in Formula One from 1978 through to 1992, through thick and thin. And I'd effectively, with friends, taken him into Formula One initially, into the Lotus Drive. And then I didn't do the Ferrari deal, but I certainly got him into Williams, and then into Williams again with Sheridan Finn. And so we were very close throughout that period, Nigel and I. And when you meet a driver in Formula 3 and he's a complete unknown, and more than an unknown, he's not actually rated very highly by anyone, and they're actually quite negative about him over a period of time, and you nonetheless continue to be very close to him, and you end up being team manager in the year in which he wins the World Championship in the car that you're managing, then it is kind of the end of a chapter and the end of a book. In my case, it was. So then I decided I wanted to move on to other things and do other things. And Nigel, for his part, felt that when he persuaded Frank to have Riccardo Patrese in the other car at the end of 1990, when he went back to Williams, he was at last having a teammate that he liked, could have a laugh with, who wasn't that quick, was never going to give him a real problem. I know in 91 Riccardo was really good, but a lot of that was Nigel having a lot of issues with the car, with a pretty complicated car, technical issues with the car in the first half of the year. But nonetheless, Riccardo quick. But Nigel really enjoyed having Riccardo as a teammate. And his understanding was that was for all the time that Nigel was going to be at Williams. That was the pairing. And by Monza 92, Nigel had discovered that Frank had agreed to hire Alan Prost for 93 without going to Nigel and saying, look, I know made this promise that we'd keep Riccardo, but because of pressure from Elf, because of pressure from Renault, we're taking Prost for the other car. Bear in mind that Prost was the guy that he fell out with at Ferrari. Then Nigel did what he was always going to do. He just said, right, I'm out of here, and went to America. Simultaneously, of course, he was getting phone calls from Paul Newman and Carl Haas and other key Americans who were saying, come over here, have a life. How many passes do you want? I know in Formula One you're limited to 5 passes or 4 for the weekend. You can have 54 if you want them here. And Nigel liked the idea of living in America. So it wasn't a big thing for him to decide to go to America. It was more this thing about Frank. Now, as Nigel saw life, I'm sure he was correct, because that would be characteristic of Frank. It's not the first time Frank would have said, Yes, I agree. And then something else would happen. A very good example would be Honda caps, which were supposed to be worn on the podium in 86 and 87, even though Frank had an obligation to have Goodyear caps on the two drivers if ever they're on the podium. And yet he promised, I don't think it was in the contract, but he promised Honda that the drivers would always wear a Honda cap on the podium. But when it came down to, that was how they were. I mean, Colin Chapman was no different in the way he put deals together as well. And Frank was just get the deal across the line, say what it takes. And I think that was a little bit of that with Nigel, if that's okay, we'll do this Riccardo Patrese thing. But of course, and because Frank didn't tell Nigel that he was going to do the deal with Prost and Renault and Elf, it does show that in reality that he knew that he did have an obligation with Nigel, because if he didn't, he would have told Nigel probably. But the fact that Frank actually kept it quite secret suggests that there was something there that he didn't want to rock the boat with. And that was it with Nigel. Of course, had he stayed at Williams, I think he would have won the 93 championship. The same way Damon probably would have won 2 championships had he not left. And great shame. I wish he had stayed, obviously. And it was fun watching him in America. And when you look back now and think that guy won the F1 World Championship in 92 and then the IndyCar World Championship in 93, it's pretty impressive. So at least there was that. But Williams. I just, wouldn't it be great if they were super quick again? I think, I felt a bit sorry for Logan Sargent. I did say going into the live stream last week that it's a big ask, this one in Miami, first time in America for him. And he did okay, but he didn't look exceptionally good. He didn't look as good as he'd looked in the first couple of races. I thought it looked like it all kind of got on top of him. Again, a lot of that is management, and I think, and I think here's, I'm pressing pause a little bit. I'm sorry if people want to get on with the comments and questions, but I keep saying how important drivers are, and by that I mean it's also really important to manage drivers well. And I know drivers, most of them, virtually all of them, have managers as such. But as far as I can see, these managers are more sort of commercial guys in the background, or I don't know what they do, carry helmets, whatever. Anyway, they're there, they're all managers. But they're not what I would call a manager in the way that they should be, in the way, dare I say it, I kind of was with Nigel and with Carlos Reutemann and a few others. And I think, you go into a garage or a pit lane at any given Formula One race, or you watch it on TV even, and you always get the feeling that everything is incredibly technical. And if they do this, the car is going to do that. And it never takes into account exactly what the driver is going through at that moment, emotionally or in any other way. And I was thinking about this in the context of Max's incredible mistake in qualifying. And that's the first time I've seen Max do something like that on his own, just completely go brainstorm, really, through those S's and completely lost the feel for the car, the balance, the stability of the platform that he needs going into turn 7. And I was thinking, we take it for granted that if they make a small change to the car because they want to go lower on the front ride height or whatever it is, or front tire pressures, that's going to produce the change and the driver will respond to it. But it doesn't take into account that the driver might suddenly have a brainstorm and make a mistake, and it's human vulnerability versus science and technology. And you could say, well, isn't that what Formula One's all about? Yeah, it is, except the Formula One doesn't acknowledge it very often. And when it does happen, they sweep it under the carpet and say, oh yeah, driver made a mistake. As if that's all that mattered. Oh, Nick de Vries locked up and went into the back of Lando Norris turn 1. Well, why? He shouldn't be doing that at that level of racing, to be honest. And Max shouldn't be doing that. And yet he did. And I wonder whether that was a classic example of the sort of lack of management about which I'm speaking, because I don't know. I would have, if I'd been there, and I'm not saying this in retrospect, I would have been saying, crosswinds, Max, you're super quick through there. You don't need to go any quicker because you're not going to gain anything anyway. Turn 7's the key. You just make sure the car's perfect for turn 7. That's all you got to do. Now, it could well be, as I said, that the engineers say that. But if Max doesn't really listen to the engineers when they're telling him how to drive, and all he really wants is the technical input, telemetry, and all the rest of it, it behoves somebody higher than an engineer to be saying that. And I'm wondering whether Christian Horner said to Max, forget about the S's, turn 7, mate. That's what it's all about. And I don't know. That to me is. And with Logan Sargent, my advice to Logan Sargent would have been going into that race, drive as slowly as you can. Enjoy the weekend, drive as slowly as you can. Let the track pick up grip and just drive the slow lap you want to drive. And the time will come. That's what I would have said to him. Didn't look to be that way. He looked to be braking quite late and doing quite a lot of stuff that didn't seem in sync with the circuit. And so, yeah, I just wonder whether that whole business of helping drivers with their driving actually has gone out the window because technology is now so overwhelming. And I think maybe Daniel Ricciardo is the first example of that in the way we saw his driving fall away in the Renault and McLaren years. Too much telemetry, not enough feel. And feel is also knowing when to be fast and when to be slow and what corners to be quick on and what corners to back away from. And another example of that is a semi-wet or a wet race. If you're with a driver who's very good in the wet and he makes a good start, the key to that is not to keep passing cars. If you pass 3 cars on the first lap or 5, whatever it is in the case of, who was it? I think Oscar Piastri passed 5 cars or something on the first lap. And the key then is to make sure that on lap 4, they back away and they just sit there and consolidate and let it go for a little bit and then go again, particularly in the wet. And I wonder how many teams think that way about their drivers as well. Well, went off on a lot of tangents there. Sorry about that. And that came from, it came from Jojo Horvath. Another question from him. Thank you for answering our questions. You're a true gentleman of the sport, and it's refreshing to hear old school, rational and intelligent insights. Many thanks. Well, thank you very much. I like to think that more than old school, I'm actually reality, and I'm scraping away all the layers of stuff that appears because of technology or instant information or other materialistic things that come into play. And I always try to just be realistic about what is going on. And as I said earlier on, actually some things haven't changed at all, like this performance window that Toto was talking about. I can imagine Rudi Uhlenhaut talking about that back in the 1950s about Mercedes as well, when they had a small operating window in some of their races compared with the Maseratis or whatever. So it'd be interesting to see if Toto's going to the design office now saying, we must have a much larger performance window. Yeah, right. What level of performance? Yeah, funny, isn't it? Everybody always has the answers, including me, of course. RDW. Not RPW, my brother, RDW. Hello, Peter. Do you think Ferrari and Mercedes are able to narrow the gap to Red Bull this year so that an exciting race season can still arise? No, I don't. I think you might see Ferrari, Aston Martin, Mercedes being closer to Red Bull and maybe in winning a bunch of races, a few races, second half of the year when Red Bull back away a little bit and start working on the 2024 car. That's about the most you can hope for. If that's what you think defines a thrilling season, I would say, sit tight, because Sergio Perez versus Max Verstappen in identical cars is actually just as dramatic, if not more dramatic, than Max Verstappen versus Fernando Alonso in different cars, in my view. And when the cars are the same, Piquet, Mansell, Prost, Senna, Moss, Fangio, then that's real motor racing. That's as close as you get to having equal machinery. And if that is the way the 23 season develops, then so be it. Because having that battle between the two, and Perez driving as well as he is, generally speaking, he's taking it to Max, and that's a great thing for the year, and I think we should all celebrate that. Um, Gogo again says, can you please tell us what you think about Mika Häkkinen's driving style and Adrian Newey's McLaren that he drove? Yeah, Mika he's one of these guys, I suspect very like Jochen Rindt, and a bit like Ronnie Peterson, but not quite as oversteery as Ronnie. But he always felt the car with the rear tyre, slightly longer corners than longer entries, if you like, than Michael. It was a good example of a contemporary, but very, very good. Good as Jochen Rindt, and that's saying a lot. Really, really committed, and able to be very good wherever he was in a race, in whatever situation the car was in. So I think his slight shortcoming was understeer, and that did happen quite a lot in the Adrian Newey McLaren because of the tyres, because of various things that were going on. And there was understeer periodically in that car, in which case Mika didn't struggle, but he wasn't the great Mika Häkkinen that he was when he had a really good front end. And so that was the only thing I would say. I think Michael in that time probably could do more with understeer than Mika could. But that's about all you could say. And I think when he had a front end, Mika was as quick as Michael, if not quicker than Kimi. Maybe that's one area where Kimi was slightly better. I think Kimi could maybe live with understeer a bit more than Mika could. And but Mika was fabulous. And what was so good about him is he didn't say much. He was a little, maybe Max says a lot because he's asked a lot of questions. There's so much media. But to my mind, Max doesn't actually talk that much. He just gets on with the job and races. And Mika Häkkinen was very similar to that. Didn't talk much, in the car, do the lap. And for those that don't know, he used to, before qualifying, he'd get in the car early and he'd picture the lap in his head and he'd drive the lap with his eyes shut in the car. Forget simulators. And he'd be in there and you'd see him. And there were many photographs of him. You could see him doing this in the car. He's sitting there, seatbelts on. And he could get it down to within 3 or 4 tenths of the lap. And he could feel it. And I did an interview with him quite recently for the F1 exhibition in which we capitalized on that, if you like. And I said, okay, Mika. He was just sitting there. And I said, okay, Mika, you're sitting in the car. We're at Spa. Talk me through what's going on in your mind as you're driving that lap. And he does a lap of Spa for us. So if you go to the exhibition, watch that one. It's really good. I really enjoyed doing it, and Mika was fabulous in it. When at one point he sort of imagines that he is passing Michael at the top of the hill, as of course he did in 2000. And he says something like, and maybe you find slower car here, and Michael is there, and I go down inside just between grass and slower car. Happy days. Brilliant. Love it. I once, can't remember where, I think it was in Canada, but I don't know where. Anyway, Michael and Ralph were up there and Mika was there. I said to Mika, how does it feel to be racing against not one Schumacher, but 2 of them tomorrow? And he said, imagine if there were 3. Mika, good guy. He's still around, and he's more fun now than ever. Actually, he's very relaxed. What an ambassador for Formula One. What an ambassador for the art of driving racing cars as well. What a great guy. So that was Mika. Do you think drivers without DRS would take more risks instead of waiting for the DRS zones, and thus we would have more natural and unpredictable racing? Thank you. Well, I did say that I thought I might do a poll about what we think about the Miami result. Would Max have won that race if DRS had never been invented? It's a very good question, I think. And because the Red Bull is very quick in a straight line, and it's quick in a straight line because it's also got really good traction and because it's really good in every area. So do I think they would take more risks? No, I don't think so. I think they hit enough walls anyway, don't they? I don't know. to me, I just wish they would get rid of DRS. I love seeing who's really quick in a straight line and who isn't. And sometimes DRS camouflages all that, so you can't really see it. And it's just camouflaged by this sort of special effect, if you like. And I don't know. And then they go wrong sometimes, and they ruin everything. Ridiculous little DRS thing goes wrong, and they mess up qualifying, or the race is ruined. Something else to go wrong on the car. So, this year, as we know, the cars are more difficult to follow as a result of the rule changes made over the winter to make the cars more stable, safer to drive, less vertical oscillation. And because of that, there's more turbulence out the back. And because of that, it's more difficult to follow the car in front. And because of that, there's more need to have DRS, so they say. So any chance of DRS being banned now, I think, has gone out the window. I don't know. I think if you've got to take a risk to do a pass, you shouldn't be doing the pass. Ultimately, I think, is what it's all about. I think a pass it's one thing to find a gap and create a gap and do a brilliant pass. It's another to say, there's a small gap there. I don't know if I can make it. I'm going to take a risk and hope that he gives me room. I mean, that's not a pass. That's Formula Ford. So if a Formula One driver has reduced his talent down to taking risks in traffic, then he shouldn't be in Formula One, in my view. He should be creating opportunities and forcing drivers into mistakes by pressure and all the normal things that you do in Formula One. So, yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question. Benjamin Wilson, hi Peter. Just wanted to get your thoughts on the Alpine situation. With Laurent Rossi's comments on the team, do you think they'll be back up to form by the end of the season? Well, I don't know what Laurent Rossi said, so I don't know. I can't really comment on that. But I do think Alpine did a very good job in Miami after a horrendous weekend in Baku, a good recovery, as kind of predicted, actually. I think the team is looking pretty good. And I think Otmar's presence there is actually noticeable, which is good, because it's quite difficult in that whole Alpine political spectrum to move anything substantial, I would have thought, in the direction in which it needs to be moved. And there's still enough really good technical people there, going right back to the Benetton-Tolman days, to make that team work. So I think what we saw there was the beginning of that. Obviously they've got to keep building on that, but they weren't bad, were they? They're pretty good. And and my biggest fear there, to be honest, is the two French drivers together. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in that situation, managing those two. Very, very difficult job. Both of them quite strong personalities. Both of them reasons to be, confident and arrogant. Is that the right word? Arrogant about their position. Gasly, because of how his career, he's a fighter, won at Monza. He's a real racer, if you like. And then there's Esteban Ocon, who's also had his Grand Prix win, who's knows the team. He's got the trust of the team. And here's Pierre coming onto his territory, if you like. And there's lots going on there, and they're both French. And that's always difficult, isn't it? Prost and Arnoux. Well, Prost and Arnoux wasn't too bad, because Rennie was pretty easy to get on with. Alain was okay. Jacques Lafitte, Prost, I don't think ever drove in the same team, did they? Jabouille and Prost was good, the older statesman. But I think Ocon Gasly is a slightly different kettle of fish, as my mum would say. Good evening. Anyway, thanks for that, because Alpine, I don't think, get enough coverage or talk when it comes to midfield performances. And they did a really good job in Miami. Very pleased for them. And right now they're upstaging, if you like, AlphaTauri, and I was going to say Haas, but Haas were not bad, were they? Pretty good. TJ Soranaki, good evening, afternoon, morning, everyone. Morning, evening, afternoon to you. Yeah, it's now 9 o'clock. I'm in Spain, for those that might be wondering where I'm doing this from. It's 9 o'clock in the evening. Sun's still up. Nice. Benny van Dries, I think you're probably from Holland, maybe wrong. From next week, Max will be starting pulling away from Perez. Mark my words. Yeah, I think you are from Holland. Well, he started to pull away from Perez from Miami, didn't he? That was a pretty comprehensive win. I think the other point is, how Perez will react. We know how he reacted after Melbourne, which was that the team can't let that happen again. And then the team can't let it happen in Miami. How can you be on the pole and not win the race? That's the question they'll be asking. Well, another good question for a poll, really, isn't it? Would Perez have won that race if he'd started on the hard tyre? We'll never know. I tend to think no, because I think Max was just so good on full tanks on the hard tyre. Just unbelievable, really, wasn't he? That was for sure. That was not an easy car to drive, and yet he made it look like a knife through butter. And that was the amazing thing. And then, when Perez is on new hards and Max is on old hards, and Max is pulling away from him, what did that do to Checo's motivation? David Nicholas, can anything outside of an FIA intervention stop Red Bull and specifically Max? Well, how about some medium to high-speed S's before a long left-hander called Turn 7 in Miami? That kind of stopped him in his tracks, didn't it? P9 is not where you want to be if you want to win the Miami Grand Prix. All credit to Max Verstappen that he got through, and they got through that first lap. No damage on the car at all, and won the race as a result. As I said on the Saturday night vid, his job is to get through turn 1 and then to get through the first lap. And if he can do that, then he's got a motor race ahead of him. But, So Andre has got a super chat thing. Thank you very much, Andre. It says, opinion on Max's celebration, pointing at number 1. You know what? I was trying to get the video out so quickly and it was so late. I didn't actually watch too much of the post-race stuff. I listened to the interviews, such as they were, and then I switched off, so I didn't see it. What was he doing? Pointing at number 1 on the car or something? Isn't that right? He is number 1 in the world. Isn't that what his fans expect him to be doing? That sort of deal. Number 1. I personally don't like any of that. You want my opinion? I don't like it. I like drivers to be very reverential and, well, all athletes, to be honest. I think they all probably copy all the soccer crowd, or the cricket or whatever, all the kissing and everything. But to me, it's like, yeah, I'm very lucky to have been in a good car, good team. Hope I did a good job today. And I would like to pay a lot of compliments to my fellow competitors and be very humble about this. Jim Clark-esque. So I don't like all that pointing and number 1-ish. Another one here, top chat. Marcos 588. Thanks, Peter, for all your insights. Your thoughts on the prospect of refueling with current tyre rigs, multiple compounds during races, unlike, say, the 2000s. Also an easy way to decrease car weight during race stints. If you're going to go back, I get your point. More chance. Pirelli won't have to spend quite as much money on doing this third compound as a race compound and bring enough of them if the cars are lighter and they don't need to withstand heavy fuel in the early laps, which requires refueling. I'm not a fan of refueling in the race, to be honest. I think I don't know. I just don't like playing with fire, if that's the right word. To me, inevitably, they would be FIA-controlled fuel rigs at a certain refueling speed, fuel flow speed, as we had before. Inevitably, there will be some that will go wrong and some speeds that won't be perfect. And there could be some dramas safety-wise. So I say stay away from it all. I mean, what when people say, why don't we have 3 pit stops instead of 2, or 2 pit stops instead of 1? What are they saying? Are they saying the Formula 1 is now incredibly boring and we've got to break it up with pit stops? My reaction to that is, if I was sitting in a Formula 1 commission meeting, I would say if Formula 1 is boring, it's not boring because we don't have enough pit stops. It's boring because we don't do enough with the technology for the fans. We don't do enough on race day for the fans in terms of live coverage of the drivers, pre-briefings on, can go out, things like that. Really cool TV, the drivers driving to the circuit in their road cars, GoPro cameras, all the stuff I've been talking about for years. There's that. And then beyond that, we don't do enough about how good the racing is between teammates in very, very good cars. my entire video on Sunday night was only about the race between Max and Perez, because it was a absolutely spellbinding day. And I thought it was in Baku as well, non-stop pressure between those two. And if that's not being brought out by the people who produce Formula One, then I think they're missing a trick. Because I don't think there's anything wrong with Formula One at the moment. Why do we want more pit stops? I actually find pit stops quite boring, to be honest, but everybody else seems to think they're a great way of, solving the boredom. The only thing I would say about pit stops is you don't need fuel. I think they should just reduce the number of people working on the pit stop so that it's a bit like an F2 pit stop. Maybe it's 8 people maximum. And if you do that, for sure, you will then increase the opportunity or increase the chance of there being an error in those pit stops, or one pit stop being longer than another. So the pit stop then won't just be your 2.3 second given or 3 second max. It could potentially be anything from 8.1 to 9.7, which would have a big effect. So if you want pit stops to change things around and bring in, reduce the number of people, that would reduce costs. It would reduce all sorts of things. Now, the reason that doesn't happen is because I think Formula One people think that these lightning fast pit stops are part of their DNA, and if they took those away, it would look like IndyCar or something parochial like that, and in their minds. And so probably that won't happen. But to me, that's a very simple, cost-effective way, if we want pit stops to be a little bit more dramatic and affect the format of the race, then, do that. I mean, imagine if Max and Perez are nose to tail and they both got to make a pit stop with 25 laps to go in any given race, and the pit stops we know are going to be 8.5 if they're really quick and 10 seconds if they're really slow. Imagine that. That's quite a lot of pressure on the team, obviously, but it's quite a lot for the TV people to talk about and for the fans to take into account. Obviously, they wouldn't come in on the same lap, but there's more chance of making errors, and I think that's the way to go. Personally, that's what I would suggest if I was on the Formula One Commission, which I'm not, but that's what I would do. So thanks for that one. Thank you very much. I haven't got the top chat. I'm now trying to get back to the real chat. How do I do that now? I've pressed and arrowed down. Oh, here we go. Things lit up again. Here we go. Okay, lots coming on. Quite a lot of Mansell, Patrick Head stuff there. Wow. Wow, so many questions. We're already an hour into this. And I'll tell you what, though, I'm going to do another live stream early next week. So fear not if if we don't get through everything. I'm reading while I'm talking, which is why I'm sounding a little bit discombobulated. Funnily enough, when I go to the top now, it's not where I was before. I'm going to start this. Gemario Monsife. Lance Stroll is just a joke. Well, you said it, not I. As I said, I'm getting a little bit tired of Fernando's over-obvious, rather condescending radio messages about how good Lance is and how well he's driving. I think there's a time when we all know that Fernando Alonso is a racing driver and he's doing the job, and constantly be telling us, Fernando, that Lance has done a great pass here or doing this, and make sure Lance has got the right brake balance or whatever. Starley Hansen is talking about the budget cap, catering money. What a joke. I think that's what he's talking about. Max, I don't know. There's a little bit of intra stuff going on. I'm not going to... sorry, I'm reading these funny things. Some of them I don't think should be in here. So, FS Consultancy. Why would Honda announce leaving Formula One, forcing Red Bull to go it alone, only to come back with another team? Probably the mess of all time for both Red Bull and Honda. Well, yeah, but it's fairly typical of Honda to do that. They do that all the time, don't they? I mean, one minute they're winning a world championship with Williams, the next minute they're leaving Williams to go to McLaren. Well, Lotus, actually. Stay with Lotus and go to McLaren. So, I mean, a lot of things Honda have done have not made sense over the years. So if you were Christian Horner with your Honda deal having done as well as you have, I guess all you would have been doing was lining up somebody else just to make sure Honda don't do what they've been doing throughout their entire Formula One career, which is come and go. So nothing new there really. But yeah, they may well come back. Yeah, I mean, new management, all the rest of it. They might come back with their own team. Who knows? There's a lot of people talking to one another at the moment, which is why I'm not. Madeleine Popper says, I think British Hamilton fans have managed to make the Formula One community very toxic in the last couple of years, and it's damaged the sport in a huge way. Really? Well, I haven't been exposed to that. I was exposed to quite a lot of anti-Hamilton stuff in the Rosberg era, but in terms of I don't know. Before, I don't know if you're talking to me about that or what. I mean, I like Lewis as a driver, not necessarily because he's British, but because he's a very good racing driver. In the same way that I like Mika Hakkinen and he's Finnish, or Gilles Villeneuve and he was Canadian. I don't think nationality comes into it, but I suppose it does. There's a lot of, I think it's that whole soccer thing coming in, isn't it? I don't know. Not being a soccer aficionado, I can't really comment. George Russell. What's this? Jack Lalane Jr. I think the tone is going down a little bit on these things. George Russell is Grosjean with a posh accent. Really? I'm sorry. He's a different class to Romain Grosjean. Romain, I was thinking today, wouldn't it be brilliant if he won the Indy 500? And he could well do. He's super quick in IndyCar. He's having a great sort of second career there, isn't he? But George is light years ahead of Grosjean, in my opinion, as a Formula One driver. Connor Clark says, Peter, do you think Charles Leclerc is overrated? I don't know what other people think of him. All I can say is I've always rated him as a driver up there with Lewis and Max, and I think he's had much more to deal with than Lewis and Max in the bulk of his Formula One career, i.e. politics and various other things as well, personal things. But I think at the moment he's absolutely at the crossroads of his career because, as I said earlier, I'd like to think Freddie Vasseur is going to get Charles being as good as he can be in every respect. And I was shocked at how messy Charles was in Miami. And I would have thought that the errors he made in Miami should have been prevented by Freddie Vasseur. That's what I'm really saying. And so I think every good driver needs good people around him telling him, when to push and when to shove. And I'm not sure that's going on. I'm surprised. I thought it was. Baku, the evidence was that it was, but maybe it's not now. Okay, what are we doing here? Connor Clark says Nigel Mansell is top 5 of all time. Well, not about all time, but interesting you chose 5 because he was red 5, wasn't he? But he's very, very good. I think underrated, would be a word that you would use to describe Nigel Mansell for sure. I think he was, in a way, the 14B and how good it was in 92 possibly worked against him in terms of the way people think about him now. They probably just dismiss it. Oh, he had an easy car. But he got the maximum from that car, and that's what it's all about. And he was really, really good. Very talented driver. Mr. Martin Christie says, Peter, you missed Horner saying they didn't recognise Daniel in the sim after he'd been ruined by another team, something you've already suggested weeks before. Always love your analysis. Yeah, well... Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we talked about that last week, and I'm surprised they're even putting him in a sim, actually. What you'd want to do is put him in a car with Rob Wilson and just let him be Daniel Ricciardo again and let Rob just say, no, free yourself up, get rid of the tension, stop this, stop worrying about braking late, all the things that are important. I'm not sure whether he can do that in a sim, and of course there's so little testing these days that I don't know any other way of doing that, but I know that's what Rob would be doing if he was with Rob. And he did do a few days with Rob very early on in his career. So, yeah, but it's interesting that it showed up in the sim, isn't it? So there's a lot of chat about people with one another. I'm happy for you to ask me questions, but I mean, you're sort of talking amongst yourselves, which is what YouTube's all about, I know, but that's why I'm skimming through a bit. Egon Faulkner says, I think Ocon and Gasly are a great team. Yeah, they're a good team in the sense that they're both very fast racing drivers. And I just wouldn't like to be managing them, because I just think two French drivers in a French team would be quite difficult. And I know, and they don't actually get on that well, but that's not a real issue, because good teammates never really do anyway, so it's not a big deal. Connor Clark says, Peter, is Lewis Hamilton better than Michael Schumacher? Wow, that's a good question. I think he probably is. Yeah, I think he's. I don't want my opinion of Michael to be coloured too much by the Mercedes years, and I like to think of Michael as he was at Benetton and Ferrari. I think. What do I think? I think Lewis is slightly softer on inputs everywhere. I think he's just got this very svelte touch, and I think Michael was a little bit more, slightly rougher, slightly, but not much. I think Lewis is slightly softer than Michael. Both short corners, both incredible feel for the car. Both of them have this hugely wide palette on which they can paint the picture they need for the car, and neither of them trapped into thinking that braking late or high minimum speed was the absolute given. Very similar in that respect. I just think Lewis slightly softer touch, slightly. That's just almost gut feeling, but it's also watching them at corners like Copse or down the hill, that left-hander in Nürburgring, S's at Suzuka, that feel you get through there. So yeah, I'd give it to Lewis actually. Is Nigel better than Prost? I think Nigel was quicker than Prost. I mean, that's pretty conclusive. Better? I mean, Prost got himself in a position to win 4 world championships. But he had an incredibly powerful springboard early on in his career that allowed him to make those moves when it was okay to do so. I mean, if you think about Prost with Elf behind him, going to McLaren with Marlborough behind him as well in 79, and then walking out of the McLaren contract and going to Renault and saying, if you don't release me, I'll just stop. And everybody's saying, oh, we can't have that. We'll give Alan the Renault drive. Nigel was never in that position. I mean, Nigel, if he'd said to Colin Chapman in 1981, if you don't, give me a race-winning car, I'm out, Colin would have said, okay, you're out. And that would have been the end of Nigel Mansell. Nobody else would have hired him. So, bear that in mind, Prost was in a position to do a bit of a Fangio, if you like, and sort of pick and choose where he was going to be to win his championships, whereas Nigel was never in that position, or created that position, if you like. But some of it was to do with where Nigel came from and his early career days, and so and British drivers didn't have the support of companies like Renault and Elf and BP and Antar and all Motul and all the French oil companies that were big at that time. So if you take that into account, I would say Nigel, yeah, absolutely, right there. And if you want real proof of how quick Nigel was, look at the lap times in qualifying for the British Grand Prix in 1990 in the Ferraris. And I think you'll find Nigel was over 2 seconds a lap quicker than Prost when Prost had a good day. He didn't have a problem with the car at all. And that's how quick. I'm not saying he was 2 seconds quicker than Prost, but around Silverstone, which is a bit of a acid test, shall we say, that's how quick Nigel was compared with Prost. Michael Ossoguini says Zach Brown, and then says something a little bit unrepeatable about him. So I'm not going to repeat it, but poor old Zach. He's very good at finding sponsors. What's wrong with you? Madeline Popper, 7 times champion, can't win a race for 1 year and a half now. Of course his fans are going to go mad. Well, they are, but don't blame Lewis. If anybody, blame Toto, I guess. That he should be taking the responsibility, because he's the guy who's got total control of the technical department, which is the department that built the car. Pachipuk, mispronounced that for sure. But anyway, which Formula One legend had the best teammates during their reign? Well, that's a good one. Well, when Alan Jones won in 80, he had Clay Reggers. When he won in 79, when he was winning in 79, he had Clay Regazzoni. He didn't win the championship, but he won races. And Clay was a very good number 2. I think that was given. I think Jim Clark always had good number 2s. Mike Spence, Trevor Taylor. I don't know. A balanced number 2 is always a very good thing. And if you look at Michael Schumacher, I guess you got to say his choice of number 2s was always pretty much spot on. Eddie Irvine, Rubens Barrichello, Felipe Massa. None of them were ever going to give him a problem, but they were all quick enough to kind of do the job and be there for testing and take some of the weight off his shoulders. So I think they would be the best ones. I mean, Clay Regazzoni was a pretty good number 2. No disrespect meant. He quite capable of winning Grand Prix, as we know, but nonetheless, a very good number 2. Always felt that. And I think if you look at guys like Perez now, Bottas, possibly Daniel, if he gets a chance again, those guys, you got to say they're great number 2s as well. Bringing out the best in the driver in the number 1. And I don't think we're seeing the best in Lando now, for the reasons I've said several times, because I don't think that Piastri is a very good number 2. He's much more of a young guy on the way into a number 1 slot. So there's a lot of bouncing in comments between Lewis fans and non-Lewis fans, which I'm not going to get involved with, and I'm not sure this is the right platform for that either. Possibly it is, but it's not really asking me questions. Chris Schinkel, Peter, your analysis is always the first look I get after. Well, thank you very much. That's nice. Thank you. I didn't mean to read that out just because it was a complimentary one, but thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, still this going on. Mansell ran away from Prost. And they're talking about Mansell. It's quite of interest in Nigel Mansell. It's interesting, isn't it? I think he's very underrated. And I was just talking to him the other day. He's in good form. Just getting his shoulder. He's just had a shoulder up. Just getting it back again to hit some golf balls again. Connor Clark says Christian Horner is the best ambassador for Formula One currently. Yeah, I think he speaks well, comes over well. Very good man. And a huge Nigel Mansell fan, interestingly. Senna did a great job in the Lotus. Yes, he did a great job in the Lotus. Honda, Aston rumours. Yeah, Rabul Kameko. We talked about that. If you are Aston and Honda are thinking of doing something again, they would be a logical company to be with, and they'll have the capacity and the facilities to let Honda operate in the UK. I think that's very key, even if they build the engines production-wise in Japan. That's where McLaren made their mistake. And I think it could well happen, Aston Martin, Honda. Roland says, I still wonder how talented Piastri is compared with, let's say, Max. All signs are that he's right there. And I quite like the way he speaks quite slowly, and he never seems to be very emotional. He's not a histrionic driver. He's quite relaxed, if that's the right word, typical Australian in a way. And it comes over very well. And I think it's a problem for Lando, as I keep saying, because this guy is good, and it's very difficult for Lando to do a better job even now than Piastri. Project 182R says, I have zero respect for Frank Williams and Patrick Head so far as running a team goes. Well, if any of that has come from me, then I apologize. Because I've talked about why Nigel left, and a lot of that was Nigel's over-emotional reaction to what was a fairly predictable thing. And I tried to tell him that at the time, of course. And I don't think Frank was particularly different from anybody else at the time. And if you look at all the great things that Frank Williams was able to do, basically live 24/7 on a breath of nothing just to keep the race team alive and to fund Patrick Head's talent. To me, they're one of the greatest combinations in the history of Formula One, Frank Williams and Patrick Head. Absolutely, and it shows that with the results. If you look at a partnership, there are not many partnerships. Christian Horner, Adrian Newey, I think you could say. But there are not many others that you could argue have been as successful or were as successful at running a race team and putting it together as Williams and as Frank and Patrick. Never-ending Winkleface is your name. Came to a home crowd cheering for Checo and ending up last. I really did feel bad for him. I think, what are we talking there? Talking about Sargent, I guess. Oh, someone said, Egon Faulkner says, congratulations on calling the Perez Baku victory, Peter. Thank you. Thank you very much, Egon. Connor Clark, Piastri is sensationally talented. He's matching Lando. Yeah, he is. He is. He should have. There's a ridiculous comment here, which I'm not going to read out. And I would ask you not for saying, this is Project 182R. Don't make comments like that, please, on my YouTube channel. It's not appropriate. Connor Clark says, the Checo victory was just a fluke. Peter was lucky on that one. A fluke? For that, virtually the entire Grand Prix distance, he held off Max Verstappen, and he was catching him before the safety car came out anyway, putting pressure on him. Max's tyres were going off because of the way he's driving through Sector 1 in order to just stay ahead of Checo. So it was no fluke in Baku at all. I think the only thing you can say there was lucky. There was the Red Bull pit wall were very lucky the safety car came out, saving them the embarrassment of having to make a call late in the race between Checo and Max as to who was going to win it. That was the lucky thing. Checo was definitely in better shape before the safety car, and obviously was after the safety car because he won the race. So there's been a huge discussion here about Max versus Lewis. You know, if you want to know, I've given many an opinion about Max and Lewis and how they drive, and I don't change from any of that. A lot of this stuff is based on very superficial watching of events. I'm not being critical of any of the comments. I'm just saying, you got to look at the way they drive in order to make real comparisons between the two drivers. Nothing to do with Brits versus Europe or Europe versus Brits or Mercedes versus Red Bull. It's all to do with the quality of the work of both drivers. And they've got their differences, but they've got their similarities as well. And both of them are absolutely, this is Lewis and Max, world class. Yaris Tech says Nigel was quick over one lap, but lacked the consistency and finesse of Alain Prost. I disagree with that. He definitely was super consistent, Nigel. Finesse, I don't see. I mean, Prost had a massive amount of finesse, but Nigel didn't have finesse. Short corners, unbelievably quick in the wet. All the fingertippy stuff that rewards finesse. Nigel had it. I think maybe Nigel was a bit, more gung-ho in the early laps of a race, but he usually got away with it, very rarely hit people. And yeah, I would disagree with that comment. I think Nigel had just as much consistency and finesse as Prost. Mark Torres. Well, he's saying that Michael's greater than Lewis. I don't know how you can say that really, but anyway. Yeah, there's a lot of funny comments like, Piastri is overrated. I mean, who's rating him? What to say somebody's overrated? You got to base it on what people are saying or not saying. And why? I would counsel everybody not to worry about what other people say and just think: is Oscar Piastri a very fast racing driver? Answer: yes. Simple as that. He's a very, very fast racing driver, very naturally talented. So. Easy Cure 001, I like that name, says, I vote for Peter as Leclerc's new performance manager. Well, yeah, he's got Jock Clear there as well, in fairness. And, Jock hopefully will address some of the issues that have been mentioned today. Because to me, that was, the shock was Max's mistake. The disappointment were the two mistakes by Charles Leclerc. That was from Miami. That was me. And then the third thing about Miami was Max's drive on Sunday, how he made up for that mistake and how he recovered from that mistake. And it was interesting that he was always showing a lot of respect to that sector one. And I said at the time, that's where you're going to abuse the tyres most. But equally, wasn't it lucky? That's where he could abuse the tyres most, because he could actually then give himself a little bit of margin as well. But when he had to, he was quick there. Lucky Reader, do you think Max is one of the best ever? Yeah, absolutely. Just as I think Rudy Caracciolo is one of the best ever. Just as I think Niki Lauda is, Mario Andretti is, Jim Clark is. And I think, I'm glad you asked that question, because you can't compare the eras, is what I'm really saying. You've got to just say he is one of the best ever. Sterling Moss was right there. Funnily enough, I was looking at an interview yesterday, 61 interview, early 61, brilliant YouTube channel. I've forgotten the name of it now. I should remember. I'll try and bring it up. Sterling Moss and Jack Brabham being interviewed simultaneously in the same interview by very, got to say, inexperienced interviewer before the 61 Warwick Farm International 100, in which they're both racing. And Sterling, you got to watch it, because Sterling comes over so well. Unbelievably impressive. Okay, Kelly Bay Films. Great YouTube channel. It's an amazing interview there with Frank Matic as well from 1961. Brilliantly fast Australian driver. But in this interview in which Sterling and Jack appear right at the end, Sterling sort of ribbing Jack about how Jack's always got good engines, he's quick on the straight. And so it's just no different from today, really. But it begins with an interview with Innes Island and Ron Flockhart, who were both racing that weekend, obviously. And I'd never, ever seen an interview or heard an interview with Ron Flockhart before. Very strong Scottish accent. And he's quite funny, because it's the first time that any of these international drivers have seen Warwick Farm, which is a beautiful circuit designed by Jeff Sykes, who used to be with the BARC in the UK and was involved very much with Aintree, and then had the same concept out in Australia with the Australian Jockey Club at Warwick Farm, which is a horse race track, so it crossed the track twice. And beautiful circuit. I never, as a kid growing up, that was my racetrack, and I never really saw it as tight and twisty. I just saw it as a great racetrack. It's had everything: the Hume Straight, Creek Corner, the S's, Causeway, Paddock Bend, Ledger Corner. And but all the drivers are saying, it's an unbelievably twisty circuit, and it's going to be difficult to overtake. And I'm thinking, wow, wasn't that twisty, was it? But then, of course, you're thinking of the circuits on which they did race. They used to race at the old Spa and Reims, and these incredible street circuits in Europe, long straights. Warwick Farm would have seemed pretty tight to them, but it wasn't actually that tight, I don't think. Anyway, when they interviewed Ron Flockhart, they say, so what do you think about the new Warwick Farm circuit, Ron? And he said, if you gave Colin Chapman a white sheet of paper and said, design the perfect circuit for a Lotus, what would you come up with? He'd come up with Warwick Farm. And I thought, what a great answer to the question. And of course, the interviewer had no clue what he was talking about. I'm not sure he'd even heard of Colin Chapman. Anyway, I recommend you go to that channel. It's some really nice stuff on there. Really good stuff. So unlike Max spins occasionally. Last year he spun in the wet qualifying at Silverstone, didn't he? Yeah, it's slightly different when you spin in the wet. I mean, that's those things happen, and I wouldn't hold that against him, but I would hold a moment in Q3 in the dry in an unbelievably good race car when he's going through S's that he's absolutely on the limit anyway, and he just goes ridiculously quickly, way over the limit. You could see going in that he was going to have a moment. You could read it a mile off, and I don't know what he was thinking. And then by the time he comes out of it, the car's like this, and he's got no chance of getting the car into 7. And I just thought, I've never seen Max do that sort of thing before. It's very different from sort of spinning on the exit of Club Corner or whatever he did. That's my point. And that, that was weird. And the fact, somebody asked in one of the questions in a live stream or two ago, it said, has Max got any failings that he needs to work on now? And I was saying, well, obviously the one that shows him up when he's alongside Perez, which is the traction episodes when there's a long straight that rewards really good use of the power and the steering on exit. But now you got to add, well, maybe he's also got a bit of a problem sometimes when he's just so confident that he just doesn't know how much right foot to give it. That's all that was. He was just massively overconfident in an unbelievably good race car on a beautiful bit of road. He loved those S's. And he's in this RB19. He's on a brand new set of perfect Pirelli softs for one lap. And the pole is there. And he's just going to go quicker and quicker and quicker. And he's probably thinking in his mind, well, I can't go any quicker anywhere else. It's about the only place where I'm not flat when I could be, maybe. I'm going to go flat into that. That's probably all it was. It's like sort of, I will be flat sort of thing. And he got away from Max feeling the surface of the road of what is an appropriate thing. Maybe the track was slightly different. Maybe there was a crosswind that was stronger than than Q2. But he was, his lap, and I think, that lap he did in Q2 was very good. And so he knew he was going to have to go a little bit quicker than that. That was the other thing. Quite often he doesn't do that in Q2, does he? And then he finds the time in Q3. And maybe that was the issue. Maybe next time he doesn't need to be quite as quick in Q2. Maybe that's what I would suggest to him if I was close to him, because he was thinking, for sure Perez is going to do that time now. I got to go quicker. And a lot of it was the Perez thing. You got to add that. Winning in Baku the way he did, and then being as good as he was kind of over the Miami weekend. Whatever Max did, sort of half an hour later, Perez had done it. He'd sort of caught up. And so that would have been in Max's mind as well. So, yeah, I'm kind of a bit all over the place with all these questions now, because there's a lot of stuff I'm skimming through because it's people chatting to one another about things that, Connor Clark, Peter, thoughts on Leclerc crashing? Yeah, well, I talked about that. I just think ultimately, of course, it's Leclerc made the mistake, and to make the same mistake twice is ludicrous, and that shouldn't happen at that level. And obviously, it's the tiny performance window, the Ferrari, Toto Wolff's performance window. Equally, there's a window in which you drive and beyond which you don't go, especially in qualifying. And that he made that mistake, and it's not the first time he's made mistakes like that, and he's made them in the race as well, as we know. And I think that's a question of, I was hoping it was a question of Freddie Vasseur getting right on top of that and stopping that. But I'm not sure he has now and will. Do you think Leclerc is in his head too much? In whose head? In I don't know, Max. I don't know who that is. Sorry. The real surprise of modern, this is Mac. The real surprise of modern Formula One to me is the battle between Hamilton and Russell. It's a real surprise to me that Hamilton is getting beaten. Yeah. Well, you weren't around in 1980, obviously, when Jody Scheckter, the world champion in the Ferrari, was struggling to qualify in the top 15 at any given race and retired at the end of the year, or maybe even when Nico Rosberg called it quits after winning the championship because there was no way he wanted to keep racing. Put that in the context of Lewis Hamilton having won 7 world championships and been pretty much in the running in the years that he didn't win, and still being pretty hungry enough to be able to race George Russell pretty consistently. So I think that's how you have to see that. It's not just this magical driver who's super quick everywhere. You got to see the effect of having won championships has made every other driver in the history of the sport slower. Every driver. And so here's Lewis. Maybe he's a bit slower now, but not by much. And he's still hungry as a dog. So all credit to him, as I keep saying. And then Connor Clark says, Hamilton is not really getting beaten by Russell. No, he's not. He's not. I mean, look at various situations. Next race, may well be ahead of him. I think Lewis's problem was Q1 when he hit the wall, when Magnussen went ridiculously slowly, and Lewis sort of just avoid hitting him, hit the wall on right hand side. And he did a really good recovery lap at the end of Q1 to get into Q2, but I'm not convinced in his own mind that he was able to lean on the right front as much as he would have if he hadn't hit the wall. Maybe that was there somewhere in the background, even if they'd said to him everything's perfect. I think there was a bit of that. And then also they did send him out. I mean, he was upset when they sent him out. There's a lot of traffic building up into the last corner for everybody to begin their runs. And by the time he was there with a car that felt more or less right, the checkered flag was out. So, but, some of that is Lewis. You've got, this is like, Leclerc not telling Ferrari to put him onto slicks at Monaco. Ultimately, it's the driver. And, if Lewis really thinks he wants to be out on track a little bit earlier, to avoid that, because he's been out there, he should force the issue with the engineers and say, I want to be out there now. And I think George does quite a lot of that. And maybe that's where Lewis is getting beaten by George a little bit in the way of running the car and running the team. And George has got this incredible way of speaking, hasn't he? It's almost like he's the captain of a Airbus A380, giving you a sort of, okay, we're currently cruising at 38,000 feet at a speed of 575 miles an hour, and it's a bit like that with George. You get that sort of feeling of commentary and on top of everything, and kind of not sure what this is, going to come in, boys, don't like that vibration from the front. It's all kind of, I'm in charge here, and I'm going to trust me, and I'll get us through this. Whereas Lewis, I think, has done things his way for so long that maybe it's not getting quite the same results within the team as George, the way George runs it. I think there's another one. Google says, does Leclerc have problems sensing the limits of his car? Well, I don't think he has any more problems than Max Verstappen, who obviously didn't sense the limit of his car in Q3 as well. I would say this. I think it's easier to put a Ferrari in the wall than a Red Bull RB19, that's for sure. Because I think there's not as good a car. And yes, the operating window is smaller. And yes, there's probably less feel coming through the Ferrari than there is in the Red Bull. I think the Red Bull, the more downforce you have, the more grip you have, and the better you are as a racing driver, i.e. if you're Max Verstappen, that is the absolute nirvana in terms of feeling the surface of the road. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we quite regularly have Max complaining about his head position or the seat position or the hands thing, because all those things, as tiny as they are, relatively speaking, really, really affect his feel for the car. And we don't hear that very often from drivers of bad cars because they're too busy dealing with understeer and oversteer and locking inside fronts and tyre temperatures and all the other stuff that's much bigger. And I think in the Ferrari, that is the case. I think, there's a lot going on in that Ferrari, and they obviously had it pretty trimmed, pretty light. But then again, Carlos Sainz wasn't slow in that car. He was about where he should be, and you'd imagine Charles would have been just a couple of tenths quicker. And it didn't happen. I was really impressed with Carlos Sainz in Melbourne in the way he drove. And I was not surprised that he came to Baku feeling pretty down about that ridiculous steward's decision that was taken at the end of the Grand Prix there, losing his position. And I'm not surprised, therefore, that Baku was a bit of a dull race for him. But I think he really drove well in Miami. I'm very impressed with the way Sainz has driven this year overall. Irish skier 94. That's a good one. Wow. 94 skier. Was that downhill racing, I wonder? What did you think of, I think this is a fan chat, something like that. Thank you very much if it is. Very, very appreciative. What did you think of the grid walk and how Jackie Stewart was treated by security? I think seeing as Jackie is a legend of the sport, the way he was treated was disgraceful. Well, I didn't see the grid walk. I hate to be boring, but I can understand from what you've said there that there was obviously some issue with Jackie not being able to walk through. Maybe he was with guests, maybe he was with Heineken, Rolex, or whatever. Yeah, absolutely right. Should never happen. And Jackie should be treated with the utmost respect by all officials and by the sport in general, as should all retired Grand Prix drivers, really, regardless of their success, but particularly Jackie, because he's brought more money into the sport than any other single individual, more than Bernie Ecclestone for sure. And he's done more for safety and therefore saved more lives indirectly than any other individual in the history of the sport. So there is really nobody bigger in the sport than Sir Jackie Stewart. And if there was an issue, I'd be surprised if that would have, I mean, maybe it's a function of in the United States, maybe the police play more of a role than at other tracks. I don't know. I didn't see it, so I can't really comment on that side of it. But any disrespect shown to Jackie, I would always get very upset about. Very. But then don't forget, Colin Chapman was thrown in jail after the 65 Dutch Grand Prix because he deigned to walk onto the grid. Was it? Or was it the podium? I think after Jimmy had won the race, he didn't have his armband on or something, and he was thrown in jail by the Dutch police after the 65 Dutch Grand Prix. 63 Dutch Grand Prix, speaking of Zandvoort, Jim Clark and Bruce McLaren were both arrested for watching on the outside of Hans Rugg, the left-hander behind the pits, when their cars hadn't arrived or they were being worked on. They were both standing there together, and because they didn't have armbands on, they were actually arrested and taken to the police station. Things have moved on a bit. I hope nothing like that happened with JYS. Sorry, SJYS. So what are we doing here? Yeah, a lot of negative comments about Lewis now. It's one race, didn't have a great race, but I think short memories. You drove pretty well in Melbourne, did you not? What are we doing here? So somebody's posing questions and then other people are answering it, which is fine, and then it makes my job easy. If other people want to answer it, that's good. Gentile Killer. It's a funny name. To win, lose championships on last laps. I've never seen anything like that in Formula One racing. So Lewis is the best Formula One driver. Last of the V10 engines, pit refueling, open cockpit Formula One cars and drivers. Well, yeah, I think you're basically talking about all the things we know and love. But in terms of championship finales, remember, we've had a few of those in the past, haven't we? What about Prost Lauda, 84, half a point in the last race? And what about 64, when four drivers went into the finale in Mexico, and Ferrari took out Graham Hill? Lorenzo Bandini, second driver, enabled John Surtees to win. Imagine that happening today. Turbo GSR, thank you very much for your turbo question. How much of Leclerc's control issues do you believe are down to setup versus an inherent design issue? I know when I race, sometimes to get the absolute most, I had to get the car set up on a knife edge. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't think the Red Bull, for example, is set up on a knife edge. I think they drive, when the car is set up perfectly, you could argue they drive on a knife edge in the sense that if they make a big mistake, something will happen. But as I've said many times, a driver like Verstappen or Lewis or Charles, and maybe a few others in the making, are very good at working around small mistakes and minimizing the time lost by very small mistakes. Every driver makes mistakes on every lap. That's a given. So that's the first point. So if you set a car up, as distinct from driving on a knife edge, if you set a car up on a knife edge, it's going to be all over the place. I mean, that is not what they do, in my experience, at any level of motorsport. You never want to set a car up on a knife edge. You want to set a car up just below a knife edge so it's drivable and you can do things with it, because there are so many variables anyway. So maybe what you're talking about, with the feeling you're getting, actually is you on the knife edge as distinct from the car. But going back to the Ferrari, as I said, for sure it's trimmed out more than a Red Bull, and for sure it has less inherent downforce anyway because it has less aero efficiency. But then so is the Mercedes, and so is the Haas, and so is the Alpine. They're all trying to get the car to be as quick as they can on the straight without compromising what they need to do with the tyres and the general grip around corners. And so I don't think you could say the Ferrari is any better or worse than any of its near opposition, Red Bull aside, in that area. No, I think it was Charles Leclerc who was over the top. And it's not the first time we've seen that. And it's beginning to be a bit of a pattern. I was able to, when he had that big shunt in the French Grand Prix, when he was leading, in my own mind, I was obviously very disappointed for him, but I was rationalizing it along the lines of he was probably just driving absolutely as quickly as he could. He'd been told there were 3 laps that he had before the pit stop, getting the most out of the tyres. Tyres were going off, a lot of pressure, and not focusing on what was right in front of him. He was thinking about other aspects of the team and performance and, how they could improve the car. I mean, just on that point, it was an interesting point, I thought, when Max was consolidating his run on hard tyres about 2/3 of the way through, he got on the radio in Miami and said, when we go to medium, what is your thinking? Maybe we need to do something with the front wing. And they got back on the radio straight away and said, Max, we're on the pit wall doing that. Just drive the car. Don't talk to us about things that we're working on. And Max just sort of stayed quiet and kept driving the car. But it was interesting that he was thinking of that, wasn't he? And they were correct to say that to Max, in my view, because you don't want the driver thinking about front wing changes on the medium tyre when he's still on the hard tyre. Potentially they're losing grip and he's still got 5-6 laps to drive on the hard. And I wonder whether Ferrari are that disciplined with Leclerc when he's saying things like that. Again, I'd like to think that with Freddie Vasseur's arrival, that discipline is there and that the drivers are 100% focused. But quite clearly, there's something wrong if the driver can basically make the same mistake in 2 days, one of them in official qualifying, on the same corner. I mean, it's ludicrous. It just shouldn't happen. And that is, I don't think that is a function of the car not giving him enough feel. I think it is a driver at the absolute edge of frustration of knowing how good he is potentially, and how many Grand Prix he should have won by now, and potentially championships if he'd been in the right car, just beginning to really become frazzled, if that's the right word. And he needs now, more than ever, he needs really good management to say, Charles, your day will come. Relax. Just drive the car the way the car can be driven and no more. Nobody expects more than that. But your day will come. And just relax, be calm. And it's difficult when you're at Ferrari. There's so much hype at Ferrari. There's so much stuff. I think somebody sent me a copy of the front cover of Autosprint after Miami. And there's a picture of Max climbing out of the car in Parc Fermé, and the headline is diabolical. Now, I haven't read the article, and I'm assuming perhaps incorrectly, but I'm assuming the gist of the article is Ferrari's performance was diabolical given how good Red Bull are. And if that, that's the sort of pressure that you're under all the time. And he knows he's quicker than Carlos Sainz. And all of a sudden, Carlos Sainz is starting to drive pretty well. And that's probably going to get a little bit to Max. So it's a big moment in the life of those managing the driving of Charles Leclerc and how to get the best from him. But thanks for that question. Connor Clark says, is Alonso maybe the greatest overall driver? Depends what you mean by overall. What I think you mean is Sunday driver, i.e. driver on race day. I think he's as good as anybody on race day. I don't think he's as great a qualifier as 4 or 5 other guys out there at the moment, but very, very good on race day. Very difficult driver politically to run in a team. And you can see that already at Aston Martin, the way he's over the top sort of, comments about how good Lance is and helping Lance. None of which the true Alonso would really be interested in at all. But you can see he's just trying to build up a whole sort of we love Fernando thing at Aston Martin. And one day it'll all come crashing down, probably, knowing poor old Fernando. But anyway, we'll see how that goes. And maybe it'll work. Maybe the Stroll-Alonso tie-up is the strongest bond ever in the history of humanity. I don't know. People talking about Will Lewis. I mean, everybody's really jumping on Lewis after Miami. Is it the end of him? Will he retire at the end? I don't think Lewis will be. I tell you what, I think if nobody was saying anything, I think Lewis would be thinking, not sure I want too much more of this. Hasn't been a lot of fun. I'm going to go to a place like Miami. I love it. I love the whole American way of holding a Formula One race. I love the people. I love Florida. And yet, what a weekend, what a pain in the neck that weekend was. He might start thinking, I don't want any more of those. But if everybody's saying, Lewis is finished, he's lost his motivation, he's going to retire, the one thing that effect that will have on Lewis is to say, you've got to be joking. I'm loving it. I'll be out there. Bring it on. So those who want Lewis to retire, stay quiet, is my advice. I don't want him to retire. I want to enjoy seeing him for as long as I could, a bit like Roger Federer. Somebody being very rude about Toto here, so I'm not going to repeat that. Right, what do we... Masson Patton. Peter, thank you for being professional. Do you think Lewis could get more out of the Ferrari than Charles or Carlos? I think he'd get more out of the Ferrari than Carlos, yeah. I think he'd probably find it as difficult as Charles finds it. Of course, if Lewis went to Ferrari, there would be a lot of, here is the great Lewis coming to Maranello. Lewis, would you like this? Lewis, what would you like? Lewis, what do you think of this? And poor Lewis is just a race driver, keeps his racing and his life pretty simple, and would say, well, give me the race car, let me do some driving and see what I think. And I think he would have the same problems, really. I don't think he would have any solution to the Charles problem, or Max for that matter. Because I don't think Max wants to go there and say, you need this engineer, that engineer, I want this chief mechanic, that aerodynamicist. Max is not like that. Max just wants to drive a race car, which is why he fits in perfectly at Red Bull. If, however, the question to ask is, if Adrian Newey went to Ferrari, how would they go? And how long would it take them to be racing Red Bull fair and square? And a Red Bull without Adrian Newey? And the answer is, 3 or 4 months, in my view. That's how quickly it could be turned around. That's how important having the right people is. That's what it's all about. It's not about the drivers. Lewis is doing an amazing job. George is doing an amazing job. So is Charles. So is Max. So is Perez. So is Carlos. It's all about Adrian Newey. And if Adrian said to Max, we're going to go to Ferrari next year, the two of us, you're going to replace Sainz and I'm going to run the whole thing, everyone could think, wow, Ferrari going to win 4 world championships now. Simple as that. There's no magic to it. Okay. Where are you? The powers that be in Formula One love Schumacher too much to let anyone win an 8th title. Well, there's a new take on Abu Dhabi. I'm not sure that was going through Michael Massey's mind when he was making that insane decision to restart the race. But yeah, I suppose that's one way of looking at it. I mean, don't forget, FIA did actually get quite upset with Michael over the years and disqualified him 1 year, didn't they? So it's not as if it's been a complete love affair from beginning to end. Never-ending Winkle face again. You provide such insight into a world of Formula One that used to be and how, in much ways, it still is the same. Interesting to hear. Yeah, nothing's changed. Don't think that because the average age of a Formula One team now is 32 or whatever, that it doesn't mean that Formula One wasn't just the same 20 years ago. Nothing's really changed. They still race cars on a Sunday afternoon. They still crash into one another. They still make mistakes in qualifying, despite all the stuff. And if they're still doing that, that needs an explanation, and that needs to be blended into the overall picture. And quite often, I think teams make the mistake of not taking into account what the drivers actually are thinking and going through and what they need. And going back to it, Nick de Vries, good example. Very, very good McLaren test driver, lots of talent, very good in Formula E, very good first Grand Prix at Monza last year. A bit overrated, I think, in terms of, wow, he jumped from one car to another. I mean, it's not that difficult to do that. But drove very well. But this year, I mean, what was that all about in Miami? To make that was a sort of Lance Stroll type error of just braking and running into the back of Lando like that. That's not what you hire Nick de Vries for. That is what you'd expect of your young Red Bull rookie who's in his first season of motorsport, really, let alone Formula One. And yet Nick de Vries, and I suspect it'll be, he made the mistake, move on, let's do a better job at Imola. But it's more than that. You got to work out why that's happening, because that shouldn't happen. That is really, not on. And be hit from behind like that is the worst thing that can happen. You're just, from Lando's point of view, a complete passenger. Same as Stroll. I say Stroll. He did the same thing in, where was it, Hungary? The year Ocon won. Okay, here's a good one. Raimundo Martin. Wow. Are there any similarities between Moss and Verstappen? What a great thing. Well, I can tell you now, if Sir Sturl was still with us, I'm sure he'd be a huge Max fan. Well, he was a Max fan anyway. He loved Max and really liked the way he drove. So that's the first thing. Of course, there's similarity. And the similarity is the stability of the platform that all the great drivers, especially including Stirling Moss, created in order to do what they do with the shortening of the corner going in and manipulating the car according to whatever is happening on that specific corner, on that specific lap, given the change in fuel load, the slightly different brake pedal pressure that was applied, the slightly different tire temperature, the slightly different ambient, the slightly different wind, all the things that change all the time. That's what they're managing. And they're managing that from that stable platform, which isn't created by just being slow and braking early. It's by making the short corner as short as possible going in, actually making the track as short as possible to drive around, and also getting a spring effect from the left front tire when they do start to release the car from rotation. And beyond that, braking at exactly the right point, not an early point or a late point, the right point. And all of those qualities Stirling had absolutely in common with Max Verstappen, who has them in common with Jim Clark, all the great drivers, Ayrton Senna, Alan Prost, Nigel Mansell, Michael Schumacher, you name it. And so there is a thing. And I remember, I mentioned this before, I remember driving up to Silverstone one year with Stirling, talking about specifically this. And he said, the only thing is the entry to the corner. That's what it's all about, old boy. And it's all about the stability and having a car that you can do what you want with once you've got the car into the corner. That's what it's all about. And that's what Max does all the time, except in the beginning of Q3 in Miami 2023. That's when he didn't do that. That's when he did what That's what he did. Let me think. Who's a good example of what Max did there? It was the sort of thing. Well, I guess it's the sort of thing that Carlos Sainz did in his earlier days and Toro Rosso, that sort of thing. Not so much now. You haven't seen Carlos do that sort of thing for a long time now, which is good, to his credit. So, here we go. Olaf Wolfen. Hi, Peter. With all the races in America now, do you get a chance to catch up with the old Speed TV guys that you had so much chemistry with back in the days that you were educating us Americans? Very nice question. Thank you very much. Not so much. I mean, you go to a Grand Prix. I wasn't in Miami. I got to tell you, I was here. But you go to a Grand Prix, and it's very difficult to catch up with a lot of people because it's, non-stop activity for a start. Secondly, by the time you've spoken to a few of the drivers and a few of the team people, there's not much of the day left. It takes so long to get through all the barricades to get to these people. And thirdly, not many of those speed guys are at the race anyway. I mean, Steve Matchett, very good friend of mine, I think is now living in the redwoods of Carolina, in a cabin that he built, probably. Great guy. But we do talk periodically and have a bit of a laugh. David Hobbs, talk to him once or twice a year, really good. He's fine. Bob Varsha, similarly. So, yeah, the great guys. We should do a big get-together, shouldn't we? It'd be lovely, wouldn't it? Maybe we should do that in Vegas. Caesar's Palace. Yeah, why not? Cosmos Trek. Red Bull won the championship after testing. Mercedes and Ferrari need to use the season as a long test session. They need to completely redesign their cars if they hope to compete with Red Bull in 24-25. Yeah, well, I thought that's what they were doing back end of 22, wasn't it? Testing and deciding where they were going to go for 23. And they both came up with the wrong answers. So, yeah, big problem, isn't it? Time marches on. But we'll see. All we can do is see. Patrick Lemire. Checo is an excellent racing driver, much like Rubens and Coulthard were excellent racing drivers. Yeah. I think he's very good. I think he's better than Rubens and Coulthard in that one area I've really highlighted, which has given him great results in circuits like Singapore, Baku, Monaco. Traction. He's always been good. He was always good in the Force India, let alone Racing Point days, and it was very clear early on with his talent that he had that. And then beyond that, he's very much a Rubens, I think. Yeah, very good comparison. Gets into a groove, very difficult to overtake once he's in a groove on race day, and slightly long corners. Coulthard, shorter corners, a bit abrupt in everything he did, but very, very good, very fast, good racer. I wouldn't have said there was a lot of comparison between him and Perez in the way they drove, actually. Coulthard was much more of a front-end driver. And perhaps, too quick to be a number two, not quite quick enough to be a number one. Weird driver in a way. I mean, he was never in the class of Mika, but sometimes he was. I mean, if you think about that race he had with Michael and Manicure, was it 2000, I think? That was just brilliant drive by Coulthard. Absolutely brilliant. But, yeah, I think he's different from those others. So Mark Torres says Speed TV days. That's going way back. Really? Oh, I've got a couple of Speed TV shirts. They're still going well, and a few jackets. Yeah, it's a shame it ended actually, because it was a really good. Frank Wilson put together a really good team there. The production guys, just brilliant, and editing guys. Really, really good time in Formula One. And I like to think that at a time when Formula One was relatively boring, as most of the fans would say, when Michael was winning everything, I think we actually made it quite interesting because we did a lot of in-depth coverage of the way Michael was driving and what he was doing at Ferrari. And I think within the limits of the world feed that we had, the stuff we were embellishing it with worked pretty well. Mini Light 71 Wow, mini lights. I love mini light wheels. Hi, Peter. I had some on my Lotus 7. Hi, Peter. What about David being as fast until Mika got into his stride? Well, I don't know if that's the case. I think David was kind of in trouble virtually from day one, from the day he got the order in the European Grand Prix in Jerez to let Mika past. The day that Jacques won his championship, which is what, 97, 97, and then beginning of 98, similar thing at the Australian Grand Prix when Mika misheard his radio and came in when he shouldn't have, and they got on the radio to DC, who was leading the race, and said, Mika's misheard his radio, he shouldn't have stopped when he did, will you let him pass please? And he did. And I think from those two moments, it was kind of very difficult after that for David to be on equal footing with Mika Häkkinen, because Mika never really repaid him for that. And he just went on winning and got quicker and quicker. And I think Mika was really good on the Bridgestones as well. I think it was one of the things that really worked for Mika, the Bridgestone tyres. And DC too, but Mika was he could really lean on them in a way he'd never been able to lean on tyres before. That really helped him. And I think Mika was always good. I think he was slightly more comfortable with the left fiddle brake as well they had when they were running that. So he had a slight advantage then. And then after that, DC was always kind of in awe of Mika, really. I think would be, I'm sure he wouldn't agree with that, but, I think he had so much respect we had more respect for Mika than perhaps a driver of DC's quality should have had, if you see my point. He's a very, very good man, DC, and tremendously articulate and very good ambassador for the sport. Done a great job with W Series, of course, and but it's funny, isn't it? When he drove some amazing races, and yet when you talk about some of the great drivers, many people often don't mention DC, and I don't know why that is. But he was good. He was really good, but not as good as Mika. I tell you what, it's past the 2-hour mark, and I've been going on, and you guys have been brilliant, asking lots of questions. There've been more intra-chat questions, if that's the right word, this stream than normal. None of which is a problem, but it means that I've been there's been a lot of chat going on, so that's why I kind of read through it all. And so I'm just going to end with a couple right at the end, and we're going to do another live stream early next week. This one feels as if it's been a little bit fragmented because there's so many chat going on from one person to another. I think in general, because my brain isn't that good, it'd be quite good if people could address the comments to me rather than respond to other comments you're seeing on chat, because it kind of confuses me really, and it takes me longer. Okay, Patrick Lemire says, in Nick De Vries's defence, who knew how bad AlphaTauri was going to be? Williams feels like the better car right now. Yeah, but that's true. But then again, some good people at AlphaTauri. I suspect the car isn't as bad as it currently looks. And don't forget, Yuki Tsunoda, in the last couple of races, has put in some pretty good race drives, fairly consistent, which is an indication that the car is reasonably balanced. Point one. Point two, even if it isn't a very good car, there's no excuse for locking up at the first corner and hitting somebody up the back. That just, regardless of the car you're in, you don't do that. And you should have enough feel at that level of driving to know, when to brake, how to brake, and what the tire temperature situation is going to be like. L. Johnson, and as I clicked on it, it moved again, so I missed it all. L. Johnson, so it was my favourite track, not on the calendar now. Long Beach, the original Long Beach was fabulous, I thought. Watkins Glen, Sepang, Malaysia. I was going to say Detroit as well. I actually really enjoyed Detroit as a Grand Prix. Many others as well that I've probably forgotten, but they'd be the ones. They're the ones that spring to mind initially, I'd say. Will Formula One ever go back to Manicourt? Flodo 1. I hope so. I really enjoyed Manicourt, actually. I should have mentioned that. Good circuit. Great corners. Nice part of France. Easy access from Paris and everywhere around. I don't know why they stopped it, obviously for money, but I think it was when Mitterrand was no longer president? It was one of the presidents anyway. When he was no longer president, all the money went away from Manicourt. Arjen de Roos says, "Hi Peter, you said Hansrug, but the left-hander is the Hugenholtz corner. We're still ashamed of our police actions at the time. You see, Zandvoort, 2023. Well, I might well be there, yeah. Well, it was called the Hansrug at that time, and it might well have been renamed Hugenholtz, but in the same way that Bottom Bend has been renamed something else, I still call it Bottom Bend. Clear, as big as a Jim Clark fan as I am, I still call Clearways. I think it's called, I don't know, I think Jim Clark might, why change the names? Anyway, Hugenholtz, big fan of Hugenholtz because he also designed Suzuka, of course. Answer those super chats. Oh, I'm looking for them. Is it when there's I can't see them any. Am I being stupid here? There's one in yellow, which I've done. Turbo, I've done that one. There's lots of mentions. So, like, for example, Sundar Thonderman, then it's got Peter Windsor, and that's in orange. Does that mean that's a super chat? I don't know. For every Kimi, there's an Alonso. Please elaborate. Your words. For every Kimi, there is an Alonso. Yes. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think the difference is that whereas Kimi has his house designed so that when he wakes up in the morning, he only has to take 2 or 3 steps to walk off the balcony and drop into a swimming pool, which wakes him up. Alonso probably goes for a 30-kilometer cycle ride and then does 20 laps of the local kart track before he has breakfast. That's probably the difference. And that's why Alonso's still racing, probably, and why Kimi is enjoying life. So, I don't know, so many. This is another one with my name in orange. I don't know if that means, again, that's a super chat, but Stacking Pain, if you had to define the formula for an era, what would it look like? You mean a new formula for a new era? I'd take off all the aero and I would bring back cast iron brakes and manual gear shifts. Call it 1966. So yeah, no, I would I'd take off all the aero. I would certainly limit the aero a lot more, and I would definitely bring back manual shifts and definitely extend the braking area. I'm told that wouldn't work. Going to cast iron brakes wouldn't work because it's the tires more than the brakes. But whatever it is, I'd make sure the braking areas were longer, and make the steering heavier, I think, and get rid of all the telemetry from the cars. Ban telemetry. Yeah, there you go. Obviously, noisy engines. So there we go. But, my favourite era, if you want to know, is 65. Last year, the 1.5 litre formula. People may say, well, the cars were a bit dinky. Well, to me, the cars were beautifully proportioned, absolutely gorgeous to look at, and there were some wonderful designs. And so I love 1965, and I love 65 Formula One cars. That's not to say I'm an old guy wishing I was in, the old days, and I don't respect what's happening in this era. I do. As you can tell, I was absolutely agog at what happened in Miami and the race we had there. And between those two, I thought it was a fabulous race. Just as I thought Baku was a fabulous race. And most people thought it was really boring. I thought it was absolutely spellbinding. So, Turbo, yeah, okay, we've asked that once about the knife edge setup. Oh, no, maybe not. Maybe it's another one. What I mean is Ferrari focusing on a setup that focuses on rotation. For me, when I set a car up on a knife edge, it was to get better rotation. So I wasn't good at weight transfer, horizontal tire grip. I'm sure you were very good at it. Don't be so hard on yourself. No, I don't believe that engineers, of course they know how to. If a driver says, the rotation's terrible, what does that mean? I haven't got rotation. What does that mean? I don't have a front end, basically, probably means. Maybe, but in the case of Vettel, it would mean I don't have a back end. Rotation is something that a driver feels. It's the moment with the least possible downside in which he has to do that insufferably annoying thing, which is change direction of the car. And that's the rotation point. And it can vary, obviously, corner to corner, lap for lap. And you want to do that when there's always a downside to rotation, but you want to minimize the downside. You want to find the point of the least downside. And when a great driver will always know naturally where that moment is. And then he will say, at that moment, I need to have a bit more back end, or I need to have a little bit more front end. I need this, I need that. Whereas I think a driver who's 99% there, but not 100%, will say, I need better turn-in, or I need better rear end. The rear end's all over the place. And they won't be quite as precise because they don't actually have that feel for where the true rotation point is. And that is why I keep saying, if you've got great Grand Prix drivers in your car, the development and the pace of that car will be an exponential thing. And you'll go round and round in circles if you continue to have average Grand Prix drivers who are very, very good, who are brilliant, amongst the best drivers in the world, but not the very best. And it's the very best that have this innate feel for the rotation point. And it's not the apex of the corner. It's not the geometrical apex. And that's so when you say Ferrari focusing on a setup that focuses on rotation, what does that mean? All it means is that Charles Leclerc is saying, at the rotation point that I know is the one I want, the front end doesn't feel quite right. I need a bit more front end. That's okay. That isn't going to result in what we saw Charles doing in qualifying. What we saw Charles doing in qualifying was basically what Max did. And he's just overusing the car in every respect. Almost looked like out of frustration. It was just bizarre. So, yeah, I think there's a bit of, and I think the telemetry, the graphics that come on screen sometimes mislead us with all this because they start talking about apex speed and braking points and all this stuff. And none of that is relevant unless you can actually get inside the heart and soul and brain of a driver who's dictating to himself where the rotation point is. The apex is completely irrelevant to the rotation point on most corners if you're doing the job of a Max Verstappen. So, yeah. So it's very difficult to set up a car around a rotation point. What you do is let the driver feel for what that is and then try to make that rotation point as minimize the downside there. Is it going to cause a little bit more understeer, or is it going to cause a little bit more problems with traction if you do the rotation point there? That is kind of how it would be. Stefan S. says, Max can drive and think at the same time and remains focused like Alonso. I'm not sure Alonso was that focused. He's talking about Lance Stroll's pass into turn one. Didn't sound that focused to me. No, of course, I'm only being facetious. Of course, yeah, Alonso. But I think they're all, Lewis is as well. Any driver who's on top of all the things I've just been talking about, that rotation point, the feel for the right point to brake, to come out of the brake pedal pressure, how much brake pedal pressure to release relative to the steering load, all those things require a certain amount of concentration, obviously, but they're happening quite naturally. And because they're on top of the car, warning the car, manipulating the car, they then have more brain capacity to think about some other stuff. Whereas reflexy drivers, who are kind of reacting to whatever the car's done from the input they've just given it, and it's a bit of a surprise, have virtually no brain capacity to think. And so therefore, if I ever talk to a sports psychologist, they often talk about, I want the driver to think about this. My reaction usually is, well, get the fundamentals right. He's going to have the capacity to do all that thinking. But if you don't get the fundamentals of the actual driving as good as they can be, forget the brain capacity he needs to do any thinking. But you're right in your observation. But the reason Max can think so much is because he drives so well. So I think I've done okay with these super chats. I hope if somebody's asked a super chat and I haven't answered it, I'm very ashamed of my inability to have found it. So a lot of them are repeats, actually. It's quite odd coming up. So anyway, it's now 20 past 10. I started at 8, so I'm going to go to bed now in Spain. But we're going to do another one early next week, so it'll be brilliant before Imola. And here's one. Franco says, just wanted to show love and say thank you for all the videos and info you share with us. Oh, thank you very much, Franco. It's very kind. Thank you. Very sweet of you to say that. Turbo says, thanks for your insights, Peter. I also mean vertical tie grip. Oh, it's on the word. Oh, tie grip and not horizontal. I actually like to hear your thoughts on using vertical versus horizontal tie grip. I really struggled with it. Well, yeah, we talked a little bit about that. The spring loading effect mid-corner you can get if you've shortened the corner and you got your rotation point as good as it can be. You do sometimes get a spring effect as well from the front tire. But that's another story, and it's getting quite complicated. And I'm going to have some ice cream, I think. Everybody, thank you very much. Thanks very much for all your comments. I keep reading. Do you think Lewis will go to another level, says Joe Code, if the car can win a championship, or is George really just that good? He can get so close to Lewis. As I said, if they've got a race-winning car at Mercedes, by definition, it'll be a very good car. And if it's a very good car, there'll be an unbelievable fight between Lewis and George. And I've been saying that from the millisecond they signed George. And I never understood why they did that, because they had Valtteri. But yeah, could he? It'd be absolute typical ironic sod's law luck, wouldn't it? If Mercedes did have a brilliant car next year, and all of a sudden they could win the championship. The championship went to George and not Lewis. What would that be? That could well happen. Absolutely well happen. If Checo had the same knack for front-end limited corners as Max, do you think he'd be able to grasp the championship this year? It's not just a grasp of front end. It's all the things that I've talked about with Max that he does so well, that Lewis and Charles, they all do, all these great drivers, Sterling Moss, Jim Clark, they all have this ability to be able to manipulate the car so that they're minimizing the rotation, the effect of the rotation point at any given corner, and simultaneously reacting to other variables that come into play. And Perez can do that to a reasonable level, but not at Max's level, in my opinion. But unusually, he has an incredible talent for when he's reached the middle of the corner, he's starting to put on the power, for putting on that power at the perfect linear rate. He's got this amazing feel for the back of the car. So it's not just a question of Perez, if he had, how can we give him the same feel at the front? Max is this all-embracing racing driver, and there's a tiny little chink here where Sergio Perez, when it's a circuit that he can actually apply it, is really, really good. And if things go his way, he can actually beat Max on the day because of that one little chink. But overall, Max is in a different stratosphere, in my opinion, in terms of everything that he can do with a racing car compared with Perez. So I think the better another question would be, if Max could do what Perez does with the right foot in those traction situations, how good could Max Verstappen be? Answer: win every race in this situation. So that's more what it thing. Thomas Mitchell, Peter, this is the last one I'm going to do because they're really good questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to these earlier. When you say longer corners, are you referring to a late apex? Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I am. Yeah, I think drivers with longer corners tend to work more with a geometrical apex. Not necessarily a late apex, but the geometrical apex where you just extend the straights leading up to that corner and then bisect the angle. That is a geometrical apex. And I think to hit a geometrical apex on many corners, you've got to have a fairly wide entry to get to that apex point. Jenson Button, good example of a very, very good late apex, standard geometrical apex driver. But all of the great drivers won't even think about a geometrical apex. All they'll be thinking about is a rotation point and manipulating the car as early as they can get into the corner. And it's a long, complicated thing, but that is basically what they do. I mean, if I'd said to Sterling Moss, where is the geometrical apex of Stowe Corner at Silverstone? He'd say, nobody thought about it, old boy. I mean, Stowe Corner is a very fast corner, lovely corner, drift the car in. And he wouldn't, geometrical apex, what would he mean? Doesn't mean much, you know. And to those drivers of that level, because all they want to do is get into the corner as early as possible. And I, you know, although I never saw, obviously, drivers from the 50s backwards drive, I'm betting that Fangio drove that way. Probably Tony Brooks. I would guess Nuvolari, Varzi for sure. Maybe Rosemeyer. I'm not sure. In my mind, Caracciolo was probably standard apex, but I think Rosemeyer was pretty much gung-ho into it. And certainly Jim Clark was. I mean, this is where when people think, what's Windsor know about? Well, I first noticed this when I saw Jim Clark driving, and I just couldn't believe how much earlier he was going into some corners compared with Graham Hill in the other Lotus 49. And then I'd read in his book that Colin Chapman couldn't believe how early Jim Clark went into some corners when he drove with him at Silverstone one day in a Lotus Cortina. He thought, what are you doing, Jimmy? You know, you're missing the apex. And Jimmy said, I never really think about the apex. I just turn in, I've got a false apex. That's the one I feel. That's the one I drive into the corner for. And then I thought about it more, talked to Nigel, talked to Carlos Reutemann a lot, noticed that he did it all the time. Then Nigel Mansell did it naturally, Formula 3 onwards. I thought, wow, this guy's obviously brilliant. And so it went on. And it's a really true, rational thing. And I'm sure some drivers don't get it even today, but it's real. Anyway, go have your ice cream, says Cameron. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody. And I'm going to go back to my other page now to do my groovy ending, if I can find it. Here we go. Thank you for watching. We'll do another live stream next week, which I'm looking forward to very much. Between now and then, have a great weekend. Be safe. Take care. Bye-bye.